"Whoa, ate too many spider webs around here." Broken Bar Vale said in a grumbling voice as he wandered through the caves he had teleported into. Perhaps had he had more time to locate a better place to teleport to, he might not have had to deal with so many sticky, clingy and irritating cobwebs. Alas, his flight from the crazy rat ladies that saw him leave the Solution Dominion resulted in him having to take what he could get. Thankfully, the crazy rat ladies did not seem to be around, which made him slightly less concerned. As he wandered through the cavernous depths, he noticed that his minimap showed quite a lot of dots which were shifting quickly between the colors denoting both allies and enemies. This did not sit well with Vale, and it only made him walk even faster. Thankfully for him, his minimap showed exactly where he needed to go to reach the exit of this web-filled nightmare. A bit farther and his minimap showed a more civilized area, with actual people and not the rapidly shifting entities that couldn't decide whether they wanted to be enemies or allies. Vale eventually reached an exit, stepping through a hole and out into a broken bar. Well, crap. Vale was not out of the underground, or at least it didn't appear that way. Instead, he had just stepped out onto a natural balcony above what appeared to be a cult gathering of some kind. The DA copyright core, combined with the chanting and the dress of the cultists, made Vale want to nope the hell out of there. He had seen this kind of shit before back when the game was actually a game, and it never ended well for any player who wandered in unannounced. Plus, there were a metric fuckton of cultists down there, and while their levels were individually far lower than his own, he didn't much desire having to plow through them all to reach the exit. That was not to say that he wouldn't do so if there wasn't another, less dangerous option. But if he knew cults as well as he thought that he did, then this was definitely one of the human sacrifice kind of cults. And, to be brutally honest, he really didn't want to get involved in that if he could at all help it. Carefully sidling along the edge of the cave from the natural balcony he had found himself on, Vale made his way as far as he could go until there was nowhere else to move. Even with this sneaky behavior, he was still barely 1/10 of the way to the massive underground room's exit. From here, all he could do was jump and hope for the best. And so he did. Leaping off from the wall and putting his absurd strength into his legs, Vale rocketed off the wall with such intensity that it cracked the stone behind him. This probably wasn't the smartest move, nor the sneakiest, as it alerted those below to the fact that something was going on above them. And, as much as Vale would have loved to simply land behind everyone assembled there and bolt out the door, he was stopped by something he should have foreseen happening. As he flew through the air, a mass of spider thread shot out from the darkness above him and attached itself to his leg. Thus, as Vale flew towards his target, the thread acted as a bungee cord and his body took on the properties of a pendulum. Much to his own embarrassment, Vale began to swing back and forth above the crowd of onlookers like he was a bargain bin imitation of a certain superhero who had gotten his leg stuck on a web line. After swinging for a bit, Vale managed to free himself and land among the crowd of cultists, sticking a perfect superhero landing before running through the massed people towards the exit. Before he could reach it, however, the exit was blocked by a mass of spider webs that Vale realized was too thick and durable for him to simply power through. He quickly checked his minimap and, much to his dismay, the only other exit was back the way he had come and several tens of miles through the caves. Fuck. Vale cursed as he skidded to a stop before he could crash into and stick to the massed cobwebs. Vale turned around and tried to make a break for the entrance he had used previously but found that it was now filled with giant spiders. He was going to have to let the mask fall to get past this obstacle. Leaping up to the natural balcony, Vale pulled off his mask and used the power of his reversed attractiveness to stun the giant arachnids, which, in turn, gave him enough time he needed to fly past them without them interfering. He bolted down the cave system and didn't stop for anything. This was, unfortunately for him, a bad idea, as he failed to notice that along a certain straightaway the ground was held together by the very same threads that were around him. He made it roughly 1/3 of the way down that section of the cave system before the ground gave way as the threads holding it together were unwoven by the spiders around them, which sent Vale plummeting down deeper into the cave system. He fell for what felt like 3 or 4 minutes before he landed on top of something hard and black. Rising to his feet, Vale was about to leap up and wall jump back up to the path he was trying to go down, but before he could, the ground beneath his feet shifted like an earthquake had rocked through it. This caused Vale to slide off of the smooth surface and plummet even further until he landed on a mass of webbing that, unlike all the ones he had been forced to deal with prior, was not sticky or clingy. In fact, the web was woven thick enough to allow him to stand, and as he did, he came face to face with a man who certainly looked like he had seen better days. He was clad in a loose and ratty old robe that was crawling with small spiders and had webbing attached to it in random places. The man's face itself was an odd sight, as it bore a wizened countenance that was tinged with tones of fanatic zealotry and insanity. The man was partially a hunchback, but that man was not the biggest thing in the room. Vale found himself looking up past the man's head and behind him, his two eyes locking with the 8 massive eyes of a spider that could easily be at least the size of an Olympic stadium. As he looked up, he felt as though the mouth of the creature twisted with a small hint of crazed joy, and he immediately felt his this fucker is crazy sense go off for the first time since he had to deal with all 5 of the crazy rat ladies all that time ago. He was wrenched out of his stunned silence when the cultist who he had laid eyes on before the spider spoke up. So you are the one whom Mother desires so much. Welcome, most honored guest, to our humble home. I am High Confessor Gareth Ginner, and by my connection to our God, I speak. Her divine voice transmitted through my sinful mouth. Mother is overjoyed that you have come here, so please embrace our hospitality, dear guest. You know who I am? Vale asked, his eyes constantly shifting between the hunchbacked man and the fuckle massive spider behind him. Oh, indeed, replied the leader of the cult, a hint of either overzealous devotion or simply utter madness tainting every word that flowed from his lips. Mother has taught us of you, the one who brought her up from the depths of pure animal ignorance and into the light of understanding. Mother were broken by her? Vale asked. Why, then, do I not remember having tamed such a massive spider? This same mother of yours has the power of a raid boss, and I remember every raid boss I've ever managed to tame. Why, then, do I not remember ever taming a raid boss by the name of a mother who was a gigantic spider? At this, the cultist's face twitched slightly, which unnerved the hell out of Vale. But Mother was not always as she is now. Back in the past, many tens of centuries in the distant past, Mother was but a humble spider. However, through time, effort, and the consumption of many, she grew to become the god we worship today. Vale was now utterly convinced that he was once again in mortal danger. It would have taken millions of deaths, not counting the lives claimed by proxy, for the colossal spider to have reached the size and level it was currently at. If what the cultist said was true, then the deviousness, malice, cruelty, and utter lack of remorse or scruples that the giant spider to end all giant spiders had was equal, if not superior, to that of the crazy rat ladies. Vale sighed internally as he came to the conclusion that he was once again wrapped up in what was likely to be another hostile takeover of a nation, this time not by the directions of a few members of the races that were also tamed beings, but instead by a malevolent spider that styled itself as a god. Vale put on the mask again and took a cautious look up at the face of the massive arachnid. He activated an old toggleable ability that he had rarely, if ever, used back when he was gallivanting around in the game, and hoped that this time he wouldn't be forced to unravel a bunch of cryptographically garbled text. What is your name? He asked the spider. What did I name you? Please, refresh my memory so I don't have to keep calling you all the time. Vale could almost see the lidless eyes of the spider move upwards a bit. Despite what he had expected, the spider had a much wider range of expression than he had accounted for. You never gave me one. The sound of a sinister, hissing and vaguely feminine voice flowed out from the maw of the stadium-sized spider. I have no name, and that is why I am known as what I am. Vale tilted his head in confusion. That claim should have been impossible to make, as he was damn certain that he had named every single being that he had tamed, and if they already had a name prior to their capture, he would simply have named them the same name that they had borne while as an enemy. This was something that he had done since day one. It was something that was an almost obsessive part of him. It wasn't OCD, not by a long shot, but it was a habit that he had, by his knowledge, never broken even once. For the first time in what seemed to be an age, Vale opened up the menu that he still had access to and began to scroll through the list of tamed beings that he had. He saw nothing but name after name after name, and he was about 2/3 of the way through the list when he stumbled upon something that caused an increase of stress to affect him. Sure enough, the spider was right. There was a single entry that had no name and was simply labeled a giant spider, and in that same entry was a level connected to it that caused Vale's hair to stand up on end. For reference, he swiped on over to the entries for the 5 crazy rat ladies and compared the levels. The spider wasn't nearly as high leveled as they were, but given that she had not originally had the power of raid boss and likewise had to gather all of her power on her own or via proxy, it was safe to say that the nameless giant spider was much more of a go-getter than the rat women had been. To grow that powerful so quickly a broken bar, it was beyond scary. Vale shook his head as he dismissed the menu, opening his eyes and looking around. It was as his gaze swept over the area around him that his mask's functions kicked in and his sight was zoomed into distant things without his consent. What he saw along the walls and the various webs gave him yet another reason to try and GTFO ASAP. Lining the walls and held in place by webbing were thousands of people, young and old, male and female alike, all inflated with bulging spherical objects within them. Some were crying, begging for death, while others were already dead, their bodies already in the final stages of having been eaten alive from the inside. Some that some would consider to be dubiously lucky, were not dead yet and were instead utterly delirious and smiling vacantly as the objects within their bodies began to move. What made things even more horrifying is that some people looked as though they had already been the host of the children of the myriad arachnids here several times over. And what chilled Vale even further was that the ones who were still alive even after that were being forcibly kept alive. The levels of these tortured victims were much, much higher than that of the ones who were left to be eaten alive, and this caused Vale no small amount of distress because he figured that this spider would be all too pleased to use him in a similar, if not exactly identical, way. Vale felt cold sweat run down his back as he forcibly shifted his gaze back towards the cultist and his wannabe god. "I certainly hope that their fate is not planned for me," he quipped, trying to both lighten the stress he had building and to make sure that he wasn't going to meet such a fate. Unfortunately for him, the cultist merely smiled widely and the spider behind him let out a light but altogether cruel laugh. "We can talk about this, can't we?" Vale asked with a hint of fear. The 2 sentient beings before him seemed to talk via telepathy before something drew their attention away from Vale and in another direction. "Gah, not again," High Confessor Gareth snapped. As he spoke, dozens of spiders crawled off from around the biggest one and seemed to be moving with all haste towards a distant point. Vale breathed a sigh of relief that he was not a target just yet. That would give him room to reset the spell he had used back when he was in the Solution Dominion and would allow him to leave whenever he needed to, even if he had no way of knowing where he would end up. "Mother certainly desires that you bear her children," Gareth said before his brows furrowed and his eyes looked up and away from the cave chamber that he was in. "But she in her infinite wisdom will allow you to stay as you are if you can find a way for her to continue gaining power." Deciding to bite the bullet, Vale asked a final question. "Why does she even need more power at this point?" The High Confessor shook his head and began to walk away. Vale slowly turned to follow him, hoping to get an answer. But as they walked away there was naught but silence instead. Vale was starting to get the feeling that trying to avoid what the giant evil spider wanted to do to him would be a Herculean, if not Sisyphean task in and of itself, to say nothing of trying to get the how of it out of the High Confessor or the spider herself. Vale followed the elderly hunchback up through some winding passageways until the sounds of battle began to reach his ears. Half of him wanted to run ahead and join the fight, possibly on the side of the people or creatures attacking the cultists and their spider masters, if only to have a higher chance of avoiding the fate that the would-be god of this cult had planned for him. Still, there was another side of him that just wanted to hang back. Maybe if he let the 2 forces bleed each other a bit, then it would be a possibility that he could use his absurd personal stats as leverage. After all, The cult would likely wish to keep existing, and the spider down in the dark would likely wish to keep its slaves from being wiped out. After all, you would not expect much in the way of religious conversion capability from spiders. Not a sane man in the world would hear a spider chittering away and think, you know what? These 8-legged freaks have a point. For the spider god. Then again, they wouldn't be able to understand the noises to begin with, so there was also that little inconvenience for them as well. If he stood back and watched as both sides killed each other, he may be able to use the act of him interfering on the side of the spider cult as a method of securing a bit more time before the big mama downer desired that he be turned into a host for tens, if not hundreds of spider eggs. That was the method he decided to go with, in the end, and when he reached a place where the fighting could be seen, he quickly came to the conclusion that his choice was likely going to be the right one. The High Confessor wandered off into the skirmish that was taking place down below, the thread that loosely held the back of his robe together slipping out and letting 4 large spider legs emerge from the opening. Vale did a double take as the former hunchback then straightened up, threw off the rest of his robe, and revealed that despite being a mad old codger, he was also absurdly well-toned and had a body for his age that would not look out of place in an action/martial arts manga or anime. The only real difference between that man, Gareth, and the other myriad buff old men in those forms of media were the 4 spindly spider legs that emerged from his back, but aside from that, he was about as human as could be. The entrance of the High Confessor seemed to boost morale for the cultists, but they were still losing ground, though not for a lack of trying to push back their foe. However, the differences between them and their attackers were far too great to allow them to push for much longer. The ground was littered with the broken bodies of cultists and spiders alike, and Vale could see that some of the fallen cultists had some very spider-like mutations now that parts of their attire had been blown away. Vale then switched his gaze over to the people attacking the cult and their spider masters. These people were armed and armored to the teeth, and what was most intriguing of all was the fact that they were carrying what appeared to be a more fantasy-esque reimagining of modern firearms. These magic-powered A-guns were spitting shot after shot, some of them going full auto while others were simply using semi-auto or 3-round burst. Occasionally, one of the attackers would point their weapon slightly above the mass of cultists and arachnids, and from an underslung attachment, they would launch a magically manifested grenade. "What am I looking at?" Vale muttered as he took in the scene. Did I wander into a fantasy retelling of a certain media series? No, this isn't exactly just that one if you factor in the fact that these aren't aliens that change and are more like arachnids. Maybe it is more like one of the cults in the far future where there is only war. As Vale dallied, the battle continued to go against the cultists. It didn't seem to matter how many threw themselves towards their foes, as round after round made of pure magic would rip through their bodies and lay them out faster than they could move closer. The only thing stopping the attackers from truly wiping the cultists out were the spiders that were crawling towards them, forcing them to divert their attention elsewhere. Still, despite the carnage, Vale refused to budge. The more people and spiders that died meant a larger chance for him to avoid becoming an egg sack, but he was getting a bit concerned. Despite Gareth the High Confessor urging his followers onwards, there was a gradual and tangible decrease in morale, and Vale was waiting until just before the cult broke and ran to jump in. However, as fate would have it, the High Confessor tried to force his hand. "Lord Vale, aid us." Vale looked over at the High Confessor and shrugged. "Well, while you people may consider that faith to be an honor above all others, I do not. I have no intention of becoming one of those things down there, nor do I want to sport the same gifts that you all seem to like so much. Despite my connection to you and your god, I'm not entirely sure that helping you would be in the best interest of my personal health." This sent a shock through the cultists, which dampened their desire to fight that much more. "But," Vale said, which raised some small bits of hope from the depths of despair that the cultists were in. But if I could find a way to avoid that fate in a permanent manner while still helping your god and her followers a broken bar, well, I may be convinced to put my existence on the line." "Extortion!" cried one of the cultists, but the High Confessor waved them down. As it stood, They were now unable to reach their foe, and if things continued any longer as they were occurring, then the cult would be finished, and their great work ended forever. I did not wish to speak of this to anyone ever, but the goddess, our mother, fears that she will soon die. It grows more and more difficult for her to molt, and she, therefore, needs more and more power to escape her exoskeleton. She has no other option but to use you in such a way, for the children born of a high-leveled being are both numerous and powerful, and such beings can endure process many times more than others can, if they are treated properly. If you know of a way to get around that, then, by all means, we will try and convince Mother to not take that course. But she has no true name, and thus her power is limited. She is gradually going to become unable to escape her own molt, and if that happens, she will die in a coffin made of her own body. This raised more than a few eyebrows, and Vale felt a small sense of triumph fill him. Well, if a name is all it takes, a broken bar, Vale said as he moved with newfound spring in his step, then I will grant one to her after I am certain that neither she nor her followers or descendants will not strike at me. The mission was easy, and it had always been easy. Every time that a den of these bug-loving cultists was located, a kill team was sent to deal with it. One by one, their lairs were purged of all within, monster and man alike, with no mercy given and none expected in return. They had all gotten so good at using the mass assault tactics of the cultists and their monster masters against them, using the narrow choke points of the natural caverns as places to funnel their hated foe into kill zones. And, of course, should they refuse to go forward and into the shredding maw of their weapons, then they could risk a few pushes here and there to move up and further back their enemy into a corner. Like the barbaric savages that they were, they could not refuse a challenge on their own home turf, and as a result, they suffered immeasurably. Each assault, each purge left anywhere from tens of cultists dead to over 2,000 or 3,000, to say nothing of the numbers of eight-legged freaks that were shredded by their firearms. They had expected this one to be no different, but they were surprised to find that this was likely to be the main base of the cult itself. The most wanted man in the entire Republic of Theon, the self-styled a High Confessor, was now before them, waiting for the Reaper to claim him. After all that they had each experienced at the hands of the cultists and their spider masters, to kill the High Confessor would be a catharsis like none other. The chaff before them fell like grain before the farmer's scythe, and, if they were counting properly, this would be the most of these fuckers they had killed in a single extermination ever, bar none. They were so close to simply decapitating the beast and leaving a power vacuum that would let the cult be hunted that much more easily, but then a monkey wrench was thrown into the works. Perhaps it was that they were losing heart, perhaps their damned High Confessor or the spiders themselves demanded it, but either way, the monster lovers held back, just out of the range of the guns that they had on them. If only they had brought something heavier, then they would have been able to keep up the assault and deal that final, decisive blow. Perhaps had they done so, the current situation would not have occurred. No one was quite sure how this single person was bodying them so one-sidedly, but the fact remained that this one, singular person was handing their asses to them on a silver fucking platter. It was plainly clear to all of them, and even to the damned fucking cultists, that this single person in his white and red ensemble was just toying with them. The man, or at least they thought it was a man, was treating them like a cat playing with a crippled mouse. He could easily have crushed them all in mere moments, but instead of that he kept them on the edge of defeat for what was only just a few short minutes but felt like an eternity. He tossed them about like an adult, throwing a few small coins around, always making sure that they stayed alive by any means necessary. It was beyond humiliating, and the man in white and red seemed to revel in that. Death was no escape, as the unknown interloper would just throw what looked to be potions of national treasure quality around like they were flasks filled with runoff. Everyone among them had now died and been fully revived and healed around 5 or 6 times in under 10 minutes. And the despair that they had inflicted upon the cultists was beginning to set in upon themselves instead. It would not be long before the last glimmer of defiance was snuffed out, and all that would be left in the aftermath of that would be a pile of mentally broken men and women armed with tech beyond what should normally be possible. A broken bar, High Confessor Gareth watched on in amazement as Vale tore the men who had done so much damage to the cult to bits and pieces over and over again, going out of his way to trust priceless treasures on them each time they died simply to bring them back so he could crush them once again. The sight was terrifying, but it was also uplifting. He now understood why Mother desired that man's body so much. His level had to be easily over 100 at the very least. Any hatchling born from a body like that would be absurdly powerful, and the mother would be able to gain quite a bit of power simply by devouring the young born that way. However, he had given his word that he would try and convince Mother to take a differing course, and he was a man of his word. If this would mean that he would be eaten alive, then that was a small price to pay. After all, if he died or was excommunicated, then a new High Confessor would be chosen, and they would not be in the same position he was in. They would not have made that bargain, and therefore they would not be required to seek Vale's freedom. Still, he knew full well that no member of the cult, let alone any children of Mother, would be able to hold him down for long. To be this powerful, he obviously would have higher resistance to poisons, toxins, and venoms. Likewise, hallucinogens and other mind-altering things would likely be ineffective at best, or downright useless at worst. Mother herself would need to be the one to catch him, and seeing as she was loath to so much as try to leave the pit she was currently in, the odds of it happening were small, to say the least. As Vale slowly stopped crushing the exterminators like the insignificant nuisances they were, at least to he himself, the powerful man then began to toss even more of those precious vials of magically produced miracle in a jar all over the chamber. Each time they landed on someone or something, they would shatter into incalculably many pieces, reducing themselves to fine dust as the concoction within spread over anywhere from one target to 5 or 6 at a time. Bodies that had been reduced to shredded meat, bone, and slash or exoskeleton began to stitch themselves back together as if their demise was played out in reverse. Tens, then hundreds, then tens of hundreds of his brothers and sisters were brought back from oblivion alongside spiders both large, medium, and small alike. It was disgusting, yet also mesmerizing. How much else did Vale have just lying about and waiting to be used in such a way? How many more of these miraculous potions did he have in his inventory that he could just use them so casually and without any care for their true value? These would be questions for later, but for now, he watched in stunned silence as something he had only seen Mother herself pull off was done many more times over. He marveled at it, at the sheer lack of understanding that Vale had regarding what he was doing. He was overjoyed that so many were brought back, but his past life as a merchant caused a part of him to scream internally as he watched priceless treasures be tossed around like they were worth less than a single copper coin. How many of those things did he have that they were so worthless to him? Spider cults sighed. Mother/Nameless Spider, the titanic spider who weaves schemes like thread. Description: what was once a no-name generic giant spider mob under Vale's control became something truly horrible after Vale left. Given the difference of time and the many powerful beings that made up the new world, such an average mob would have been a dime a dozen. But this spider was cunning, devious, and cruel beyond measure, preying upon both the races and upon other beings. While the Rattan Council had millions upon millions of followers to devour, this spider had none, which makes its ascent to the power that it currently has all the more impressive, if not terrifying. As you would expect, this spider is female, but it does not see Vale in the way that so many others do. It wants Vale not as a breeding partner, per se, but as a vessel in which it and its children may lay their eggs. She believes that those born in this way will be far more powerful than any others, which in turn would make them useful as meals to grow in power. She grossly overestimates Vale's ability to withstand what she plans to do to him, and likewise, she does not wish to do this merely to cause pain. Countless thousands of years of survival and growth have taught her that death is always around the corner, and it can only be staved off through power and control. While the large cult of idiot members of the races that are devoted to her are more than willing to offer up their bodies, they are not nearly enough. Each molt is getting harder for her to pull off, and it may not be much longer until she dies, trapped in a coffin made of her own dead exoskeleton. To avoid that fate at any cost is a necessity for her, and while she does have feelings for Vale, They are muddied by her frantic desire to keep herself alive and to make sure that she has many powerful children, if only so they and their descendants can be eaten. Perhaps Vale will find a way to avoid that fate and to ensure that a mother does not need to worry anymore about such things. If that happens, then the nation above her caverns will almost certainly never be able to survive as it is. The rise of the Spider God and her rule over that land will be all but assured at that point, but whether she can ever escape her own nature is an unknown. High Confessor Gareth Kinner, the most devoted slave of the Spider God description. The cult of the Spider God has existed for ages, and as one might expect, it is a man/woman chosen by a divine providence to stand at its helm. The title of High Confessor is one that the leader of the cult will carry until they are beckoned by Mother deep into the cavernous depths that stretch under the nation. Each and every member of the cult knows the fate of the chosen, but they do not consider it to be a bad one. What higher purpose could there be than to serve Mother? Gareth is the most recent High Confessor and has led the cult to a height that was never before achieved in its history. He is a zealous man with unshakable convictions and is hell-bent on securing his God the place that she deserves. He dresses in simple robes that have obviously seen better days, and yet despite his unkempt appearance he speaks with a voice that commands attention and respect. Under his guidance, the cult has seen a massive surge in membership, but his recruitment may be a bit too much too quickly. A cult like the one he leads can only grow so quickly before it garners the attention of those who are threatened by it, and while the numbers of cultists grow, so too do the forces against it. While he wishes to show them the true way, there are many who would rather see their nation burn than see it become a theocracy devoted to a spider of all things. Gareth may have come from the gutter and rise through the ranks quite quickly, but his ambition may yet lead him to make a few ill-advised choices and put the cult in a rather precarious position. As a staunch conservative, any change to the status quo, even a good one, can frustrate him. Of course, change is inevitable, and whenever a certain player enters a situation such as this one, the inevitable tends to happen sooner rather than later. Republic of Theon side. President John Coritis, the man trying to repair a damaged state. Description: John Coritis is not what some would call a career politician by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, the only reason that he is the president to begin with is because no one else wanted the job. In the wake of the disastrous events that led to his predecessor nearly being ripped from the presidency by an angry mob, John was left with the dubious honor of trying to keep the republic from collapsing. As much as he wishes to implement sweeping, and much-needed, reforms, there are those who stand in his way and exercise heavy control over the apparatus of state. Every attempt to repair the damage dealt to the nation has been either brutalized by their lobbyists or prevented entirely, to say nothing of how some members of government simply refuse to lift a finger for anyone other than themselves. But despite all of that, he has made some small progress and, as a man of the people, he does have a not-so-insubstantial base of power stemming from the masses. However, that has only made those who seek his downfall that much more interested in preventing him from doing much of anything. There is one silver lining, though. Both he and the people arrayed against him have a singular group that they despise with a passion: the cult of the Spider God. Their actions were part of what led to the disaster of the previous administration, and their actions before and after that have cost countless millions of dollars of damage to men and material alike. Their desires for better working conditions may be something he empathizes with, but the fact that they drive men and women to strikes and protests causes, in his eyes, more damage than is needed. Likewise, they worship a spider of all things. A spider, add in their desire for a theocratic state and they become, in his eyes, more than a simple threat. Thankfully, there are those who seek to stop their spread and, in so doing, help prevent the collapse of this already wounded republic. It is, therefore, well worth the irritation of his constituents to funnel money into the bug stompers. Now, if only he would stop going into trances, talking to no one, and carrying around what is obviously some kind of weird relic. Alan Yerpel, the bug hunter extraordinaire who tries to destroy the cult. Description: there exists a cult within the lands of the Republic of Theon. It is dedicated to a malevolent and cruel dark god, a spider whose hunger and malice knows no end. It supposedly dwells deep underneath the nation within the labyrinthine tunnels and caves that are just out of sight, and it and its twisted children crave nothing less than to see all of the good, godly people of the nation above them turned into mad devotees, all willing to give up their lives for that monstrous spider. And Alan Yerpel hates that cult. He hates all regions dedicated to gods and beings he does not approve of, but he hates the spider cult most of all. Since before he was even a teenager, he has gone out of his way to unmask any cultist he could, leading to many arrests and even a few executions, and over time he has grown a following of like-minded men and women who want to see the bug lovers. Yes, they are actually arachnid lovers, but they don't much care for semantics, burn just as much as he does. He is occasionally seen talking to himself, but that can be chalked up to the stress of trying to save the innocent and weed out the guilty. No one is sure why he hates all of these cults with such a single-minded focus, but no one wished to ask him either. The last few people who did ended up in a shallow grave, and nobody wants that. He has been odd as of late, almost as though he was a puppet of sorts, dancing on strings. Who or what may be pulling him around is something that, hopefully, not even he will find out. After all, there must be some reason for his blind obsession, and at this point, even he can't recollect exactly where it came from. Well, at least he has his old childhood friend and current president to help him with his growing exhaustion and anger issues. Vale finished yeeting the last necessary vial of revival potion at a dead member of the spider cult and stepped back to appreciate his handiwork. A few moments later and the last victim of the slaughter would stitch themselves back together and, hopefully, be thankful for the fact that they were alive again. And as for the members of the wannabe colonial marines, well, they were mentally shattered. Unlike a player who had experienced their character dying in an almost incalculable number of horrific and painful ways, these guys had never faced the Reaper in such a way before. Being killed off and then brought back so many times in such short order was more than enough to break their minds. Although to be completely clear, he had not expected them to find their minds like this so quickly and after so few revivals. If Vale was going to be brutally honest, it was a bit disappointing. Still, he had, hopefully, shown that he was more valuable as he was currently than as a host for spider eggs. Hopefully, the giant nameless spider that the cultists worshipped would be more inclined to let him remain. If not, well, he was more than willing to utterly demolish anyone in his way and was considering simply lobbing a few pots here and there to either burn down the base or collapse it. He was of the mind that the nameless spider would want to keep the cult around, as it almost certainly took a major effort to make in the first place. That all said, the ball was not in the spider cult's court, so he would let them and their masters take the next move. He had played a damn fine hand, but now the next round needed to begin. What would the spiders do and say? How would they react? He would plan a bit ahead in his head, and depending on the reactions he got he would move forward a bit in one direction or another. The fear he had when faced with the titanic arthropod down there in the depths had clouded his judgment and overall ability to come up with ways to get out of that dangerous position. Fear did tend to do that to people, so that was understandable. But now that the situation was less overtly calamitous for him, the gears in his head began to whir. He had lived in this new and strange reality and faced enough crazy shit that he was gradually getting more accustomed to the relatively high ambient stress level. Now he just required a response, and from there the game would resume. A broken bar. A broken bar. That is all the more reason that he is made to carry my children. But mother, we know what he is capable of. Even should we try and take him, the chances of us being able to do without costing our faith an irreparable loss would be nearly 100%. Surely we can find someone or something better to take his place. Perhaps he knows of some other being that would meet the same criteria, or perhaps he knows of an object that can. My child, growled mother, cutting off the high confessor. Do you truly wish to be the first to stand against your own God? Do I need to remind you what happens to those who are cast away from my grace? Gareth gulped, but he doubled down. Great Mother, our most glorious goddess, please know that I do not seek to rebel. I merely wish to honor my word and to find something that can take his place. He is, in my eyes, too valuable as he is to be used as a mere vessel for your young. If you give us time, We will find a way to empower you for ages to come, possibly even to the point that you will never need to worry about the strain of molting again. If I cannot do this, then I will willingly suffer any punishment you deem appropriate. I merely ask for a small window of time. For one such as him, there must be things that he knows that could assist you." Silence reigned in the telepathic connection as Mother thought about what course of action she would take and force her children and worshippers to take. Finally, after several minutes, she spoke into Gareth's mind. "You have 3 24-hour cycles, starting now. If you cannot find both a replacement and a more permanent solution by then, you will bring him to me and bind him yourself and then face my judgment for attempting to deceive me." High Confessor Gareth bowed his head and began to withdraw. "It shall be done, my lady." A broken bar. Vale walked through the base that the cultists called their headquarters. He had a vague feeling of unease in his mind, like he was being watched and stalked by someone or something both malicious and not in any way, shape, or form either a monster or cultist. This was not the same feeling that he had felt whenever the rat women were after him, nor was it anything remotely like what he felt when those weird glitched-out humanoids appeared, and it was also nothing like what he felt when near those strange obelisks that the desert/sand elves employed. No. This was a feeling that he had experienced many times before, but to his recollection, he had never once experienced this feeling in the new world. This was a sensation that any player worth their salt would know and know the meaning of. He was being stalked, but not by a person or entity native to this new world. He was being followed by what he was sure was a player, and a player with a decently high level at that. As soon as he realized this, he immediately began to prepare. PvP was always a challenge when one side prepared for longer than the other, and he had no idea how long that the other side had been preparing for this fight. Every bit of preparation would help, even if it was less than that of his foe. Vale brought up the menu and began to use his eyes to rapidly select and prepare everything he could in order to set the stage. The cave tunnels were cramped, so he could use that to force his foe into a more opportune position. Or at least he would be able to if they couldn't teleport, that is. He took one final hallway that led directly into a dead end, and once he reached it he quickly turned around and threw several different potions and other mixtures behind where he once was. The vials shattered on the ground, the walls, the ceiling, and on a single stealthed entity that stood a bit taller than an average dwarf, or just the average height of a dwarf player. This noise must have alerted the other beings in the caverns, but that was merely a secondary tactic. The true aim was to make it impossible for Vale's potential assassin to hide, and the gunk that was smeared all over the dwarf player did just that. The enemy player clicked his tongue and rushed in, trying to reach Vale before he could do anything to counter. However, any assassin worth their salt would know that if your target knows that you are after them and are close, that they would have the advantage in regard to short-term preparation. Vale had removed the player's element of surprise, stealth, and the additional damage and debuffs that would be applied to him should the sneak attack have succeeded. Now it was merely a battle between a high DPS assassin build and a roughly generalist build, but the thing was that Vale, as a tamer, was almost never truly alone. Besides, after meeting the giant, nameless spider, he had acquired a new fast travel point on his overall map. He didn't need to kill his foe. If he did, he would lose a valuable tool that could replace him as a victim of the cult and their goddess. Vale lunged forward and took a decent stab to the kidneys, but he was close enough that he could grab the other player and force the fast travel system to ignore the damage he was taking and the danger he was in. The two of them blinked out of the dead end and into a certain massive underground cave and fell right on top of a massive web. Vale looked the other player in the eyes and then tossed him away from himself and out towards the distant walls with a smirk on his face. The dwarf player got stuck to the walls and began to try and use his escape abilities to try and a broken bar escape. But it was no use, and he quickly realized how fucked he was when he saw Vale look over at the stadium-sized spider that was now eyeing him maliciously and yell a few words before tending to his own wounds. Terrible fate substitution no jutsu. He was without a land to call home, but to be completely honest, he was kind of fine with that. He had attempted to save the collection of dwarven lands that he had based himself in, but that was proven to be impossible. He was ultimately correct to have left it to be destroyed by the Rattan, but a part of him still yearned to fight back against the monsters to the bitter end. That was probably the dwarven nature of his avatar shining through, but the real person inside managed to keep that unneeded and unwanted sense of dwarven shame buried away. He still was on a mission to kill the elusive Vermin King, that other player who had allowed the Rattan clans to unite and destroy his adopted homeland. However, that mission was now one of his own choosing, not one forced upon him by the idiot kings. He was still very upset that so many dwarves died so horribly or were enslaved, but he did also find a bit of twisted entertainment and mirth at the knowledge that the people who mocked him for not having a beard were now either dead or wishing they were. After that whole mess and a half, he had left the underground and taken job after job as a hired assassin. Even if he screwed up during his stealthy bits, he was a very high-leveled player, so if he needed to go loud then there were few, if any at all, that could hope to stop him. However, as he went about completing contract after contract, he began to hear whispers regarding a person whose attire bore an absurd likeness to that of the so-called Vermin King. First, he was said to have appeared in the Trelawney Kingdom, helping a band of outlaws overthrow the legitimate government and install the leader of the bandits as the new queen. Then he was claimed to have been spotted fighting alongside the beastmen and having aided them in bringing ruin to another domain. Finally, he learned of the person once again interfering in global affairs, this time having been instrumental in not only preventing the fall of the Solution Dominion but also ensuring its recovery back to what it once was. The man seemingly would pop around from random place to random place, seemingly with no rhyme or reason to be deciphered regarding the destination he would next manifest at. A bit of minor mental math later, and Morgaram No Beard had determined the singular thing that united all of the disparate adventures that the other player had been up to, and the realization of who the Vermin King was hit him like a freight train. This was no normal player that he was aiming to eliminate. This was a Tamer, and not just any Tamer, but the Tamer. He wasn't after some random person. He was after the man single-handedly responsible for fucking over nearly every decent player at one time or another during their history in Neon Genesis Fantasia. The man who had stolen every raid boss at least once and before anyone else could get to it. The man who had unleashed the army of monsters and mobs at the end of the game's lifespan. The man whose rampaging creatures had killed him and, somehow, consigned him to living in this new world. Vale. It was fucking Vale. When he became aware of that fact, he knew what he had to do. It would only be a matter of time until that bastard came to another monster's aid, so it would only be a matter of waiting near and around one group of beasts or another until that asshole showed himself. Truth be told, he was already on a mission to shadow the exterminators as they wiped out a cultist lair when he saw the troll appear and wreck house. Those people stood no chance at all, and they were toyed with as though Vale had inherited some of the sadistic tendencies of his menagerie of monsters. He watched and waited patiently as the bastard wiped the floor with those he was supposed to keep somewhat safe, and as the Tamer revived literally everyone and everything that had been slain by the hands of the exterminators. After that, there was a bit of dialogue before Vale and the cultists' leader split ways. He stalked that asshole for a while, preparing to deal a single, decisive blow. He would get revenge for all that had happened, both in the game and in this new world. That bastard had oceans of blood on his hands, even if it was spilled by proxy. He was more than willing to indulge his dwarven desire for revenge this one time, even if it wasn't his current mission. Not that he had succeeded in that, though. Unfortunately, he had failed to check his minimap and followed Vale right into a trap of his own. That was unexpected, but not the end of the world. The cocktails tossed at him rendered him unable to one-shot the asshole of a troll, but a few quick and precise strikes in just the right places would be enough to lay him out. Surprisingly, Vale met his charge and held him in a tight grip even as he stabbed him in the side. Then things went downhill at a breakneck speed. He knew this feeling, but he had not expected it. In fact, it should have been nearly impossible to pull off what was happening, especially with the pain that Vale was likely feeling surge through him. The space around both of them shifted and they fell a few meters, crashing together on a broken bar non-sticky webbing. His confusion was his undoing, and in that moment of confusion, he was yeeted across the vast cavern and into more webbing, this time being so sticky that his attempts to free himself merely resulted in him getting more stuck. The next option was to try and teleport himself out of that situation, but something prevented him from doing so. Morgrim looked around and discovered why he was unable to bail. His eyes nearly burst out of their sockets as he saw the question marks above the colossal spider's health bar and the other various symbols denoting that he was in the presence of a raid boss class monster. He switched his gaze around after he heard the odd ramblings of that asshole, until he saw enough to realize that he was now royally fucked. He didn't want this. He didn't want any of it. He didn't want to have been taken from his old life and forced into this new one. He didn't want to have his adopted home destroyed. He didn't want to have his whole life upended so many times over, and now he was facing one last fuck you from that bastard who had started everything. He tried to scream out his frustration, but a sting from a spider or five had removed his ability to do much of anything. He cursed his fate, he cursed God, he cursed everyone and everything that he could before the pain of what was happening to him overcame him. He had lost everything 3 times now, and he knew full well that he would never, ever be able to escape the hell that was about to happen to him. And, if he knew those monsters like he thought he did, he knew that his torment would last as long as they could drag it out. He would face a fate worse than any he could have ever feared would happen to him, and there was no one alive who would come to save him. As the dwarf player slowly stopped being able to fight back, the nameless giant spider that styled itself as a goddess couldn't help but be both surprised and amused. While it could easily tell that the dwarf was not as high-leveled as Vale was, the fact that there was now a means for it to have more children to use and, of course, to feed on made the trade far more appealing. Besides, despite the malevolence that it possessed, it still had some small reservations about its decision to use its Tamer, the one who had awoken it from mere bestial primitiveness and elevated its mind to true sentience as nothing more than an egg sac. Yes, a broken bar that would indeed have been a waste. Besides, if the others all over creation were to have found out about that, if it had transpired a broken bar, well, they would have made survival an impossibility. Now that she no longer had nearly the level of anxiety over her own fate as she had mere days prior, she was able to see things a bit more clearly. Vale had been popping around the world recently, and if he were to simply no longer be doing so after everyone knew that he was around a broken bar, well, there would certainly have been an investigation and she would have been visited. Besides, some of those others could smell him from miles away, and if they smelled him in that state, a broken bar, yes, this was for the best. Also, she could now use this little event as a tool in her own way, if she played her part right. She looked down at Vale, who was using a round of potions to heal himself, and felt something she had never truly felt before. She had seen countless worshippers, including some that she held in relatively high regard, die at the hands of others. Some were slain by chance, others by the hands of their fellow worshippers, which was perfectly acceptable, as the strong should always overcome the weak, and some to outside forces. But this was the first time that she felt, what did the worshippers call it? Concern? Worry? Yes, those things, and a broken bar something else as well, a broken bar something that bubbled and boiled inside her, something that made her lethargy and slothful nature fade away more and more as she both dwelled on the feeling and looked at Vale treat his wound. It was hot, violent, and it urged her to do something, anything in retaliation for this insult. Even when the most recent and current High Confessor had tried to talk her out of her previous decision, she had not felt this, not anything like it. A broken bar. This was anger, rage, the same petty and vindictive malice towards those who stood opposed to her plans that she had felt so very long ago when the first iteration of the cult was destroyed, and her scheme back then was foiled. She was powerful enough that she didn't need to worry about her own safety should the cult be wiped out again, but this was a fury that somehow burned both hotter and brighter than it had back then. She could feel her body warming up, the flesh beneath her carapace twitching and going through the motions that lesser beings would call a warm-up stretching. She knew her body was essentially demanding that she get up and bring ruin upon her foe with her own power, and he was nearly about to do just that. She was gearing up to move upwards through the ground and break out from her self-imposed seclusion underneath the capital of the nation above her, but a voice called out to her and diverted her attention. A broken bar. He won't be nearly enough, you know. Vale spoke up as he popped another potion. His wounds were nearly fully healed at that point, and by all rights he could have just waited until his natural healing power as a player did the rest. But he continued guzzling healing fluids from the bottles for dramatic effect. Truth be told, he wasn't using the stronger ones. Had he been doing so, he would have been healed to perfection after just downing a pair of them. No. He was a wily one, just as, if not more so, than the big fucking spider that he could tell was stewing in all manner of turbulent emotions. He could see the creature's lips twitching and her massive black eyes shifting between himself, the other player, the High Confessor, and the cave ceiling above her. He knew what she wanted to do, as it was exactly what he expected from something that was as malicious and cruel as the rat ladies had been. She saw him yank the dagger out of his side. She saw him pop potion after potion to heal his wounds. Despite her actions and words to the contrary, Vale had that nagging feeling that what prevented her from wanting to keep him as he was currently and her desire to reduce him to the state that the other player was soon to be in was her overwhelming instinct for survival. She had survived so long and gotten so powerful and so massive after being just a mere giant spider, and now her age was beginning to get to her. She wasn't made to be able to get like this, and that fact was nearly about to trap her inside her own shared exoskeleton. He couldn't imagine what being buried alive would feel like, but he could imagine that it would be just as terrifying as being doomed to die inside a recently shed husk of your old body. She would die as her new body crushed her inside her old body, and that was a morbid and horrible fate. Using the other player as frequently as he expected her to would mean he would meet his final end far too quickly. She would use him up and then be left to eventually meet that fate anyways. She had something to keep her from worrying over much about survival for now, but when that dwarf died, she would go right back to the way she was just moments prior, scared, anxious, paranoid and driven by nature once again. Thankfully for everyone, well, okay. Not everyone, just the people on the nameless spider's side and those on the side of the other tamed beings. High Confessor Gareth had given him an idea as to how to make sure that he never had to worry about giant spiders and cultists coming in the night to take him away and make him a tortured victim of the spider's instinctual drive for survival. He just needed to give the big girl a few nudges in the right direction and, in so doing, he could, hopefully, set up a situation where he could mold her in a slightly less terrible direction. As she was, there was no goddamn chance that she could maintain control over any decent territory, nor could she fully maintain control over the people she would use as cattle. Even if she could keep control through fear and malice, the rebellions would eventually be too much. She would lash out, and she would be forced to kill everyone and then flee to another place and start over from scratch. And, if he was being honest, she would die of the aforementioned terrible fate long before she could establish anything remotely like what she had now again. He needed to give her a path to maintaining a less cruel control, otherwise, the only cultists she would get would be the mad and the damned, which was what she already had. A slightly more gentle and manipulative approach was needed, and he figured that he knew just what kind of carrot he could dangle over her head to get her to change, even if only a small amount. He knew the one thing that had the best chance of ensuring that she would outlast the doomed dwarf by thousands, if not tens or even hundreds of thousands of years. Something he had neglected to bestow upon her back in the game. Something he figured would render that instinctual fear of an ever-present and terrible death a nearly moot point. A name. He had just the one for her. Not an overly imaginative one, but it would work. Hopefully. What do you mean by that? The giant spider could not fully grasp what Vale had said. The high-level dwarf would not be enough? Enough for what? Surely something with a level that high would be enough to keep her going strong for quite some time, if not eternally. The hatchlings that would emerge from that being's flesh would be powerful and would grow in strength just as quickly as any of her other children. They would become strong, and then she would allow them to breed once or twice, and then she would eat them. That was how things had been before, and it was how things would always be. The dwarf would endure for eternity, His status as being such an anomaly made that a certainty. Even beings such as he and I can die if we are taxed enough. What you will be putting him through will tax him greatly each time you do it. You may give him weeks, maybe months between such things, but eventually, he will die. Even a body such as the ones that he and I both have can and will break and die given enough torment. And when that happens, which will happen, what will you do then for the sake of survival? Will you go back to being the paranoid, instinct-driven being you were just a few minutes ago? I suspect that would be the case, more often than not, and it will only drive you to new depths of cruelty. Vale's words were spoken with the tone of a man who was beyond certain of his ideas, and the fact that he was so sure of himself let the slightest bit of the spider's old survival-driven self come back. The more she thought about it, and the more she looked at the thousands of people who shared the dwarf's future fate, the more she realized that the odds of the dwarf lasting more than a few tens of sessions was slim to none. He would die, and then she would be right back to where she was before. Then what solution would you have? The spider asked with a nearly undetectable hint of anxiety. I will give you something that will change things forever. Something that, had I given it ages ago, would likely have led you down a radically different path. However, a name will not come for free, as much as I would love to give one here and now. A name. This was something that would almost certainly change things, just as Vale had said. In this world, names had power. The average monster had no name, at least not a true one. If a tamers gave their ward a name, then that named entity would find their power and ability to grow and expand by at least a small order of magnitude. All of the others had names, and only she was without one. Likewise, they had gotten their names long before this new world existed, meaning their names did not grant them much power, if any. Those names were now essentially just the same as one given by one member of the races to another. But to be given a name by a tamer in this new world, that would change everything. Her ascension and survival would be all but assured. Then what must I do to earn such a thing? Vale chuckled a bit before replying with a question of his own. You wish to rule over the cult forever? Yes. The spider nodded in response, or at least made the equivalent action, which Vale picked up on rather easily. There is an old saying along the lines of the tighter an iron fist clenches, the more grains of sand slip through its fingers. An iron-fisted regime can only maintain full control after it has learned to choose when to crush and when to nurture, and only then when it knows these things and acts correctly can it hope to keep the masses aligned to it. Meaning? Obviously, the spider had never taken any classes in philosophy or the workings of governments, and so Vale had to explain. It means that the way you do things now will only result in the people you want to serve and be obedient to you eventually deciding to attempt to destroy you. Fear, cruelty, and oppression are powerful tools, but to rely on them entirely will only result in your new order eventually being undone by your own hand. I will help you gain control over this land and the place above it, but you must learn to know when to spare the rod and when to indulge in it. A donkey that has been beaten once may do as it is told, but to beat the creature repeatedly will only cause the animal to bite the hand that disciplines it. The spider took Vale's words in, but it could not really understand the full weight behind them, and Vale seemed to pick up on this. Turning to Gareth, he asked the man a few questions while taking the response to them as well. Gareth, I assume recruitment has been difficult lately. Gareth nodded. And some people have left of their own volition, right? Once again, Gareth nodded. And the number of people leaving the faith has been gradually increasing, month after month. No, Gareth confirmed non-verbally a third time. Those who left claimed they could not stand with something so cruel, correct? Gareth now refused to nod, but his silence and lack of movement was enough to confirm Vale's assumptions. Lastly, it is assumed that the reason your bases have been being targeted so frequently and found out so easily is because there are either traitors in your midst or that those that leave go and report the location of the bases, correct? Again, there was no action taken, which confirmed Vale's words as true. Now, then, Vale said as he got up from where he had been seated. Add all that together and you get the picture, more or less. Your iron fist has caused grains, in this case, people, to slip out, for one reason or another. Likewise, it has resulted in the merging people to stand against you, which causes you to tighten further, which in turn causes more to slip away. If this continues for much longer, only the truly desperate and the absolutely mad will remain. And you can't make a good, lasting cult that way. And what would you suggest we do? Gareth asked, almost pleading to know how the destruction of his faith could be averted. Simple, Vale said matter-of-factly. You lower the doom and gloom, you act to make the people who denounce you look like they are liars, and you engage in a multi-pronged propaganda campaign the likes of which has never before been seen in this nation. Slowly build support through charity and compassion. Gather supporters by drawing them into the truth of the cult gradually, like a fish being slowly pulled towards the fisherman, and when you've made enough allies and fellow cultists, you begin to destroy your opposition's reputation with gradually more potent mudslinging. Vale then pointed at the stadium-sized spider. You're a spider and your spider cultists act like what you are, and weave a web of deception and the manipulation so fine and hidden that your foe won't know he's hopelessly trapped until it is far too late to do jack shit about it. Most spiders don't go out and cause undue harm to their environment, as that would lead to them being crushed. Instead, stay in the shadows and build up your web bit by bit, with more and more flies turning into spiders to add to the web. And once the web is big enough, the target you want to trap can be led in and find themselves in a battle they have no chance of winning. And once that all happens that way, our broken bar. Vale then looked the big spider in her eyes. Then, and only then, will grant you what you need to overcome the shackles of instinct. It was as ordinary a day as any could be in the Republic of Theon, and Jacob Hudson was busy on his usual errands for his family. He was very unenthusiastic about this, as he was as rebellious and irritable as one would expect from someone his age. His face bore a scowl as he walked through the marketplace, the family wares that were to be sold today being held by a single hand and draped over his back. He was fed up with the bullshit of his life, having to listen to his prudish parents and the conservative elders of this rotten place. How he wished that he could find someone, anyone, who would empathize with him and see the world as he saw it. The whole republic was a house made of rotten timber and rusted nails, with termites eating away at it even more. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer, and those in the middle were forced to go one way or the other. That was plain to see, and it, along with so many other hypocritical things about the nation and society he lived in, made him dream of one day being the one to open the eyes of everyone to the fact that they were nothing but blind sheep following the leader into the slaughterhouse. All of the elders in this dumb society were blind to this, it seemed. Either that, or they were either too naive to understand that there needed to be radical, immediate change, or they were just complicit in it altogether. His teachers tried to instill in him the values of duty to the society he was in, the acceptance of the way things are, and the utter lack of desire to change anything that they had. He, along with many others of his generation and others, no longer bought into that. The old needed to be removed, their weakness cut out, and a new, better system had to be put in its place. It would be one built on a better, stronger foundation, and his generation would be the ones to make that a reality by whatever means they felt was needed. So, there he was, a disaffected and angry youth with issues relating to his family and community, walking down a street during the early hours of the day, wearing a look that anyone could tell meant that he was just as rebellious and anti-establishment as one could be. He was a perfect target for anyone who had a decent ability to manipulate people, and anyone who spoke of radically changing the system so that the powerful and righteous could change things would be able to get his ear relatively quickly. It just so happened that, as he walked down the road and grumbled to himself, he saw someone on the corner handing out pamphlets. The man was a broken bar. Well, he looked rather strange. He was taller than a human ought to be, clad in fine clothing that was white with red accents, and wore a mask over his face. Despite this, nobody seemed to pay him much mind, yet there were a few people who did seem to notice him and took a slip of parchment from him now and again. This piqued his curiosity, and what damage would a few minutes delay to getting his overly conservative parents' goods to the market cause? Besides, this guy's clothing was snazzy as fuck, and he did seem to give off an odd vibe. It wasn't anything bad, per se, but it was strange. And that mask a broken bar. It just seemed like it hid secrets that the idiots that were running this nation into the ground didn't want people like him to know. He walked over to the tall man, and the person in question offered him a sheet of parchment. "Hello, can I interest you in a private group debate session? The topics are regarding the current society and its degrading effect on the greater soul of the people in it. Can we expect that you would join us?" The man's voice was hauntingly bizarre, as it seemed to flow like a kind of auditory honey equipped with grasping claws that took hold of his and pulled him into accepting the offer. "Sure," Jacob said, surprising even himself with how quickly and how enthusiastically he accepted the offer. He took the sheet in his offhand and looked it over. The debate was scheduled to be at a time he could easily deal with and in a place that he could easily reach. Likewise, written near the bottom was a line that insisted that he bring anyone else who wanted to debate with him, as there would be seats aplenty, to say nothing of the free food and drinks. He couldn't help but feel a sense of destiny swirling around him now. This was what his generation needed. Finally, there would be a gathering of like-minded people, all of whom would discuss the issues of the day in a friendly environment. He just had to bring his friends, who in turn just had to bring their friends. "Will you be here tomorrow, too?" At this question, the masked man in red and white nodded. "I'll be here all week." "Do you mind if I bring some people here to talk to you? I get a strong feeling that they would want to join this debate too." Jacob couldn't see it, but he could swear that the face behind the mask began to smile widely. "Of course. We need all the bright, intelligent, and observant people we can get. The more voices that can add to a good debate the better, and from what I can gather about you right now, I'd have to hazard a guess that you and your friends would be just the open-minded and good people that we need." Jacob beamed. He had never been so thoroughly applauded for merely existing before. He could feel his pride swelling, and the thought of him being accepted into some elite and secret club of people who were obviously more intelligent than the sheeple around him was enough to put him over the moon. "I'll be sure to come back by tomorrow with a few others." "Can I have your name, for future reference?" "Certainly. I would love to let a fellow genius prodigy know of my name if I can hear yours as well. That is, you can call me Vale." "Just Vale." "I'm Jacob." "Well, it has been a pleasure, but I've got to run." "Nice meeting you, Jacob. I'll save a spot for you in the debate hall." Jacob then sped away, eager to get through the work he had to do so he could prepare for the debate as early as possible. As he scampered away, Vale chuckled. "Another man who's just as much of a sheep as the people whom he hates, and another piece on the board added to our side." Step 1 of cult indoctrination is complete. Now to prepare for step 2. Today was the day, and Jacob was beyond excited. He had, of course, neglected to tell his parents and elders where he was going and what he was doing today, as had all the other teens that he had introduced to the masked man in white and red. After all, his parents and the elders of the community would no doubt throw a petulant, childish hissy fit if they knew that anyone was inviting their precious children, whom they were obviously hoping would stay macron docile, to a political/social debate. Thankfully, the current president had at least somewhat obeyed the people who voted him in. Ironically, after the catastrophe that happened during the last president's tenure, the electoral system had to be heavily reworked and, unfortunately for the powers that be, that allowed for a so-called a man of the people to be elected. Of course, there were still interests involved that neutered a lot of the attempted reforms, but Jacob was sure that wasn't actually the case. He and so many others of his generation were positive that the current president was in the pocket of those groups, and all that he had achieved was merely a show. After all, when the next president came around, all of the minor changes would be undone the same day. So, while he had a day off, he wanted to make the most of it. He and his close friends of his gathered together and then broke apart. They each would take different routes to reach the place where the debate would be held, all to make sure that their nosy elders wouldn't be able to trail them. They had spent enough time out here that they knew how to lose a tail, and while none of them knew whether they had won or not right now, they assumed that they did. The elders were too determined to see them return to the soul-crushing ways before the reforms to not notice that he and his fellow teens wanted radical change. The gang split up as soon as it gathered. and Jacob took a winding path that led through places that no adult could easily pass through. He was sure that he was being followed by something or someone, but he never could catch a glimpse of whatever apparently had eyes on him. He just felt like he had eyes on him, but there was never anyone around who seemed to be watching. Anyway, he was about to run late, so he made a break for it and managed to reach the location just before the doors closed. The eyes that had been on him seemed to have lost him before he got here, so that was a positive. Jacob wondered what exactly the debate would be like, but at least the food and drink would be good if you went by the smell alone. A broken bar. Vale had set all of this up. He had sent a few birds to watch the disaffected people as they made their way to the hall, using his ability to see through the eyes of entities who allowed it to give each and every attendee the feeling that they were being watched and followed. It was a bit of a gamble, one that would hopefully make the affected people believe that they were being stalked and that this cult that they were being introduced to was the only place where they could feel safe and surrounded by like-minded individuals. If his gamble paid off, the people attending would believe that there was a conspiracy to try and stamp out their desire for change. All they needed to do was to speak up about the feeling, and from the dominoes would begin to fall. A single person going to a clandestine meeting feeling like they were watched did not a conspiracy make, but if all of them had the sensation of somebody stalking them up to a certain point, then the only real answer for such a coincidence would be that there are people trying to catch them in the act. Cults thrived off of paranoia and the ingrained belief that everyone not a part of the cult was both out to get you and trying to destroy a hidden but perfect truth. This would be the test that would shape how the operation would continue from now on. He just needed someone to speak up. It didn't take long before one of the attendees did voice their feeling, and this caused the chain reaction that Vale had been looking for. The snowball of anxiety and paranoia began to roll. And now Vale just needed the third part of today's plot to take center stage. It would not take long after that before the wheels would begin to turn ever faster, and from the pieces would fall into place. Sure, a few people would slip through and fall away, but once a cult got its recruitment rolling and had enough people in it, the number would only begin to grow from there. As the religion grew in size and power, it would begin to attract more people, which in turn would add more power and reach to the cult, which would in turn, well, you know. He waited as the paranoia began to reach a fever pitch, and then he struck. Everyone, he said with a voice commanding attention. I hear what you've been saying, and I must thank you for bringing this to our attention. Vale paused for effect with his whole body positioned in such a way that it gave off clear feelings of concern for the people in front of him. As I am sure you are aware, there are those who think that men and women of greater intelligence and observational ability such as yourselves should simply obey the original status quo. We all know people who think that things should be as they were prior to today, that change should not be implemented, that people like you should be held down and prevented from being all that you were meant to be. Vale walked up to someone and put a hand on their shoulder and acted like he was an old friend, which was a traditional method by which a cult would groom a potential new member. Two of the best ways to bring someone into a cult were to either love bomb them and slash or convince them that they were special and that only the cult could help them unleash their true potential. This was the case for any cult, for when everyone else doesn't seem to see the potential greatness that the cult sees, and when the cult that showers you with affection, why would you not want to join? A typical cult made full use of the tribalistic nature of their quarry to draw them into the tribe, and from the tribalistic nature would prevent the new member from easily escaping. When a cult had its claws deep into someone, the cult would become everything for them: their family, their friends, their community, their life. Nothing outside the cult mattered, no one outside the cult mattered, and when that point of a member's initiation was reached, well, there was little chance of them breaking free without some major intervention. Now, despite the trouble that such people wish to cause true prodigies like yourselves, why don't we talk together about how to overcome the limits that these broken bar people try to impose upon truly gifted individuals? Vale watched as his charisma score and the basic template for cult recruitment began to work their magic. A smile once again formed on his face from beneath the mask, and while those attending only saw the faint impression of someone who was smiling because he was glad that they were safe, The truth was obviously far from what they envisioned. There was no camaraderie in Vale's smile, just the face of a man who was glad that the template that the current spider cult could follow had turned out to be such a success. You just don't get it, do you? This nation is broken. It needs a forceful change. It's because of people like you that nothing good ever happens. You ungrateful child. Do you not know how much we have sacrificed to let you have the life that you have? This life where people like you have been constantly shooting down every attempt made to make a difference. There are people out there that want to change things for the better, for all of us, and because of people like you, they will never be able to do so as easily as they should. Name these seditious people. Name them and point them out. We need to know who it is who is trying to destroy the way things ought to be. This is why those who can see the truth don't want anything to do with people like you. Anytime someone wants to change anything for the better, you rat them out and string them up. Since you don't want to push the world forward, then I want nothing to do with you. I hate you, all of you, you blind, deaf, stupid fools. Don't you talk to your parents like that, young man. Look at your mother. She's crying. Now go to your room and I'm leaving. I have people who know me for the man that I am and accept me. They were right. They were all right. You really are enemies of progress, of enlightenment. Never, ever talk to me again. As Jacob slammed the door behind him, he walked out into the late hours of the day. It had been several weeks since he had started meeting with like-minded people from all over the town. At first, he had felt some degree of apprehension. A small part of him wanted to keep up good relations with his family and his elders. Sure, they were conservative and thought that all of the progress that he and his generation wanted, and voted for, was a load of horse shit, but he still cared for them. Now his eyes were open. Now he saw them as the parasites that they were. They were roadblocks on the road to greatness, his greatness. Vale was right, they were in his way and would always be in his way unless he removed them from his life. They were impediments to the enlightenment he was promised, baggage holding him down, holding him back. How had he been so blind to as not have seen it? They didn't love him, not as the Arachnos Church did. He was told it, time and time again in the early days of his joining with them, and their words rang true. His elders, his parents, a broken bar, they had never loved him. They saw him as a tool, as a useful pawn to put into place to take their own place and uphold their own backwards ideas when they eventually kicked the bucket. He thought that he loved them and that they loved him back. But they never reciprocated his affections, not in reality. As he stormed off into the night, he saw others from the growing gathering doing the same. This only further deepened his belief that what the church said was true. How could it not be, when so many old fogies all viewed their children the same way? The church had advised him and the others to confront their families today, to show them that there was another, better way. It seemed that their fears were correct. There were many, far too many, who did not wish for the betterment of all and just sought to be stuck eternally in an ever-deepening and darkening rut. A broken bar. Vale watched as more and more people trickled into the hall. His buffs, most of which was temporary due to chugging no small number of potions and wearing certain gear, had been more than enough to force this a new version of the cult into being far more quickly than it normally would have. A cult would normally take months, if not years, to even begin to reach this level. But it wasn't just this town that had a resurgence in what was once a nearly extinct underground and deviant faith. He had dipped into his absurd storage to hand out a few hundred potions for the few remaining true demagogues among the surviving cultists, further buffing their ability to convince the masses to join what was essentially a sudden death cult. Normally, only the truly disaffected would have bitten down on that hook. But with a bit of buffing, the number of not-so-secret cultists jumped up not by mere tens or hundreds, but by exponents that made their total number far exceed the most optimistic expectations. Truthfully, the potions he had handed out were extreme overkill. These were potions designed to buff the basic charisma of a near-max level character by several hundred points, more or less. In the hands of a level 30 or level 40 person, however, that was like using a VR version of a WW2 railway cannon that had been modded to have 100% accuracy as a fizzwater. It was obscene overkill, and based on what the spiders kept telling him, the cult in those places was growing faster than it was here. But then again, He was just using his own abilities and his basic knowledge of the steps by which cults recruit people. He had let the cultists know how to do so more efficiently, but aside from that and the potions, he kept his hands clean. He wasn't sure how far along the cultists were, but he figured that with the potions buffing things, that they had probably gotten to the point where they had fully indoctrinated at least 20 to 40% of the people in their areas of operations. As for himself, well, he was just perfectly content to take things slowly. After all, he didn't worship a bunch of monsters and he had absolutely no intention of ever doing so. He just needed to take a bit more time and drive the wedge between these people and society a bit deeper. It would take a bit more indoctrination, along with getting them to make a few more promises and do a bit more groupthink rituals, and just like that he would have a bunch of sheeple who truly believed that they weren't and that everyone who wasn't one of them was instead. He both marveled at and was concerned by the realism of how easily he could get reasonable, fully sentient people to just a broken bar throw away everyone and everything that they had ever loved, cared for, valued, and more. The nature of the human beast, and the other races, in this new world's case, was that of tribalism, and it was frighteningly easy to make someone turn on their tribe and defect to another, along with viewing their former tribe as a non-persons. Then again, a fringe, ultranationalist far-right-wing group had done that rather easily in Germany, and the same had happened with a left-wing group in Russia and China. Humans, and, in this case, the races, were far less logical and more easily swayed by empty emotion than they led themselves to believe. And, unfortunately, he knew he was also a victim of that primal nature. A group of men sat in a conference room inside a large stone building. One of these men had just given the rest of them a detailed report of how the growth of a certain cult had caused many dangerous thresholds to be reached and had already finished detailing his plan for how to eliminate this cult. However, his plan had been shot down at least 3 times during the meeting, and he was getting desperate. "I'm telling you the truth. These bug-loving cultists need to be wiped out to the last. That is the only way that this nation can and will survive to coming months. They are already nearing the point where between 30 and 40% of the nation's populace are a part of it, so a quick, decisive genocide of their members will be the only real way to deal with them in any kind of timely manner. And I understand that it is such, but you must understand that our nation cannot handle the upheaval that your plan would cause. The number of members of this damned cult has risen rapidly, and I am fully aware of how dangerous they are. However, as they are now, the plan you have proposed will only result in a massive civil war." Alan, the man who had just had his scheme shot down for the 4th time in under 2 hours, was Alan Yerpel, a man who had a serious axe to grind both with the cult and with their spider overlords. No one save Alan himself knew the reasons behind why he hated the spider cult so much, but his and his company's actions thus far had led to himself becoming a member of the government despite also being the owner of the PMC/Freelance Inquisition group simply known as the Exterminators. The person who had shot him down for the 4th time was the current head of the Republic of Theon, the president who had, for the first time in quite a long time, been elected by a popular vote. This man, John Coratis, was a man of the people, but he still held some rather conservative views. Not without good reason, though, as the majority of these views were directed at the fringe elements that had caused the Republic so much trouble in the past. The spider cult in particular was a group he wanted to be neutered, but as the group had rapidly swelled in number, he was forced to admit that the time in which he could have destroyed them had long passed. Despite his disdain for them, they now were a decently sized group with influence that would rival some other parties. If they were smaller, he could convince the people that exiling them was acceptable, but now was a different story. He didn't like them at all, but he was also not about to risk the dissolution of the nation by trying to destroy them. He was elected by the people on the platform that he would bring much-needed reforms and equality, and he would be seen as a hypocrite if he tried to crush the cult now. As much as he hated to do it, he now needed to get the cult to be a positive and beneficial force for the nation. Otherwise, there would be another great calamity that would spell the doom of the Republic. Their base was larger than he could have ever feared, and as such he now had to treat them as a valued member of society. Alan and his plan to gather them up and wipe them out was enticing, but it would never work and would instead merely spark a civil war. He would not allow that to happen, as it would leave the Republic open to the wolves that surrounded it. A house divided upon itself could not stand, especially against the neighbors who eyed it with envious gazes. Add in the myriad monsters that made the less inhabited places their homes, and you had a recipe for disaster if the cult was not able to be bargained with. I don't think there would even be a chance of a revolt. Alan yelled, clearly letting his anger rise to the surface. You can't honestly think that they will simply get in line, can you? You can't seriously think that they can be bargained with, reasoned with. At this point we don't really have much of a choice but to bet that they can engage in positive relations with everyone else. I wasn't elected just so that I can drag this nation into another calamity. In case you can't remember what happened mere decades ago, I recommend going to the library and reading up on that. We already lost so much, and any further unrest would almost certainly result in the Republic being destroyed both from within and from without. I will not be the last president, nor the one known for the death of this great nation. Then I'll do it myself, Alan snapped, which resulted in Jun drawing a line in the sand. If you do that, I will remove you and your people from all positions of authority with an executive order. You will no longer have the backing of the government if you and yours go down that road, and you will be treated like any other criminal would be for every life you take and every bit of property that you damage. Do you understand? Alan scowled before storming out of the conference room, obviously intending to ignore Joan's ultimatum. Jun sighed and shook his head as the door slammed shut behind Alan. He had lost a valuable ally today, and all because someone or something had, in only a few short months, managed to pull the damned cult from the brink of erasure to the point it was at today. In hindsight, he should have authorized Alan's purge months prior, as the cult was supposedly on its last legs back then. A final coup de grace back then would have prevented this issue, but he had foolishly believed that the exterminators had things under control. He should have sent in the National Guard, or maybe the army itself, to grind the cult to nothingness, but he had gotten too complacent once he heard that the main base of the cult had been found and was under attack. He didn't know what happened, but it was clear that the tide had turned. Now all he could do was to use his position to hopefully prevent the cult from doing anything too nefarious. It was a long shot, but at least he hoped that he could get them to stop engaging in mortal sacrifices, or, God's willing, he could get them to become a more socially acceptable faith, at least in terms of behaviors. But what were the odds of that? In a deep chasm within the caverns that stretched beneath the Republic of Theon, a single entity waited as patiently as she possibly could. However, the usual influx of bodies for her and her surviving children to use as egg sacs had gone from a trickle to nothing at all. Normally this would have caused her to lash out and order that the cult do as it had long since been commanded to, or face the consequences. However, this time things were different. She had gradually come to the conclusion that Vale had wanted her to reach, more or less. She was still cruel and a monstrous sadist who viewed the races as cattle, but the thoughts that Vale had put in her head had caused her to view the cult less like a ravenously hungry beast and more like a rancher. What use there was in using normal bodies would pale in comparison to the gains that could be gotten if the cult was allowed to not just expand, but encroach on the territory of the Adventurers Guild. She held no real affinity to the other monsters and myriad creatures that also inhabited the Republic or even the caves beneath it, and as such, she had previously ignored them so long as they had not gotten in her or the cult's way. Now, after a few talks with Vale, she saw the benefit of using the other creatures in this area as a useful tool. The average level of the sacrifices up till recently had been steadily going downhill, but once the nation above her was in her clutches, then the average level would rise by a great margin and, with that, came the average baseline power of the children born from their flesh. To deny her nature and not demand sacrifices was a taxing thing to be sure, but Vale had said that a truly great predator knows when to fatten up their prey before making the kill. If letting this new scheme pan out would secure for her not just a steadier, and larger, supply of bodies but also a name, then perhaps she could act like a normal spider and wait for the prey to fall into her new web. However, She did have to admit that it was all getting rather a broken bar boring. Sure, she had gotten bored being down here before, but without the usual members of the races to torment it was just so painfully dull. She was half expecting that she would die of boredom rather than a failed molting at this point, especially now that the original main base of the cult had been moved elsewhere. And by elsewhere she meant somewhere many miles away. The old base had been abandoned, and that was one of the reasons why the trickle of sacrifices had stopped. The past few months had been painfully dull, but the reports coming in did paint a good picture. The cult was expanding at a faster and faster rate, which was only possible due to Vale convincing both her and the cultists to both change their ways, even if only temporarily, and also due to him doping everyone in the cult up on charisma potions. If the current progress was to be believed, then it would only be another few months before the ratio of cultists to non-cultists in the Republic would be roughly 6 or 7 to 1. Once that happened, then the next phase could begin. She was intrigued by the idea that Vale had put forward. If his assumptions were correct, there would be a chance that something called a referendum would be held when enough people wanted a massive political change. If that happened, then the odds of the transition of government from a republic to a theocracy would be painless and bloodless. While she was not normally the kind to desire a peaceful transition of power, Vale had made it clear that a violent revolution would only result in more annoyances popping up. And so, she stayed put in this deep hole that itself was deep underground, occasionally straining her body here and there to keep herself from getting too out of shape. Vale had said that her relative inaction might also have been a reason why each molt was harder and harder for her, and that did make some sense. She knew that other creatures that did not maintain activity would gradually lose their ability to move until they died from atrophy, and she didn't want that to be how she met her end. She was in the middle of these stretches when a tingle was sent down the lines of thread that were all throughout the cave system. Something was coming down the tunnels leading to the abandoned former main base of the cult. Based on the vibrations, it was clear that this was no small band of hunters, but instead was a massive gathering of them. The damned exterminators had come back, but she did not expect them to find her. Although, even if they did, they lacked the power to kill her, let alone injure her. Her children acted as her eyes and ears, and she watched the hunters set up strange containers all over the place. She contacted Vale via a telepathic link and asked him what he thought the objects were, and in response, he practically screamed at her to cut the abandoned base off from everything else, either by rockfall or by an airtight seal of webbing. She wasn't sure what he was so scared about, but she obliged his request all the same while keeping a few eyes on the machines. Her brood managed to seal the former base off from the rest of the caverns just in time, as when the devices began to pump out some kind of fog, she quickly realized exactly why Vale had been so insistent that she do what he had told her to. The mental anguish of her children flooded her as she felt them suffocate. As the chemicals dumped out by the fog machine affixed themselves to her kin's breathing systems. The fog clung to everything, and she was horrified to feel connection after connection fall away into nothingness as the chemical fog claimed life after life. This angered her immensely. She was now beyond livid and was nearly ready to force her way up and out of the caves and into the open air, but she caught herself before she could take that course of action. She purposely severed the rest of the afflicted spiders from her mind web and let the rage inside of her settle. She quieted her instincts by repeating over and over that she would claim her bloody vengeance in time, but she needed to wait a bit longer. Once the cult had secured dominance, then she could bring her foes to a terrible and torturous end. The prize of gaining a name was just in front of her, and she would be a fool to lash out and ruin her chances forever. No, like the spider she was, she needed to play the waiting game. She would let these bastards shred that web, but they would soon find themselves in another, larger, more inescapable one soon enough. Although, there was one asset she could call upon to deal with the nuisance that had presented itself. The members of the races that had deployed those fog devices didn't need to wear any protection, even as the fog swirled around them, and this gave her an idea. Vale and his little experiment were far above the place where the gas attack was happening. Maybe, just maybe, he could use that wit of his to turn this to her advantage. She sent another message to him, and the two set to planning. Vale let out a small laugh as he finished discussing the plan with the nameless spider. He had indeed come up with a fairly good one, as the spider had anticipated, and now he and the gaggle of cultists that were part of his experiment were making their way out of town and towards a certain cave. While the experiment was already a resounding success, he had been of the mind lately to simply keep it going. This was not because he found religion in the form of the spider cult. No. He was continuing it because, like the type of gamer that he was, he just couldn't bring himself to stop now that he was on a roll. Like a good MMO player, he found grinding towards as much of a 100% completion as he possibly could to be a decent way to get his brain to release the happy chemicals. Every time some new cultist found their faith in what he already knew was a dumb thing, he got a surge of dopamine, and by now he was nearly finished with this town's conversion. The board was nearly fully set, and the cultists here had already sent missionaries out to spread the cult even further, with Vale donating a heaping helping of charisma buffing potions to smooth any rough parts. He could barely keep himself from smiling as he and the nearly 1,000-strong mob of men and women descended upon the entrance to the old headquarters of the cult. He did feel a bit wrong doing this, but lately he had found himself more of the mind to help his tamed beings and their followers with pretty much anything they desired, regardless of the unethical or immoral nature of it. Perhaps it was a bit of a give and take, where the myriad tamed beings gained a kind of freedom and intelligence from their connection with him, and he, in turn, gained a more broken bar unethical kind of morality from them. As for why it was so immoral, well, the majority of the tame beings that he had connections to were of a darker sense of alignment. And as for the majority of those that weren't, those were of more neutral alignment, morally speaking. So he essentially had a whole lot of devils on his shoulders whispering temptations into his ears, with a mere dozen or so angels doing the same, but advocating for a more moral way of doing things. The current actions he was taking were, in a way, a mix of both good and evil. Sure, he was spreading a cult of evil spider-worshipping crazy people around like the plague, but at the same time, he was trying to make both the cult and the target of their worship a bit more tame compared to what it once was. And as for right now, well, he was bringing a bunch of people to do something about a gang of men and women who engaged in animal cruelty, so that was technically a moral thing to do, right? Well, he'd leave that can of worms for more dedicated philosophers down the line. There was no sense in trying to wrap his head around that when odds were that he would find himself written about both in flattering and unflattering ways decades or even centuries later. He would act, and he would let the future generations decide whether his actions were morally reprehensible or not. It was better for his mental health to just not think about things, and so he didn't. But right now he had to direct the mob, and with the weapons at the disposal of the exterminators, he would either need to use a living wave or some better tactics than that. Then again, what better way to drive home the point that those who were loyal to the big fucking spider that was underground were better than those who weren't, than to show off his own power and pretend that the nameless spider was the one to grant it to him. Vale metaphorically rolled up his sleeves and directed the mob to form a makeshift arena in which he could fight. Once the bug hunters came out, he would show both him and the mob exactly what true power really was. A broken bar. That was a nice bit of catharsis, joked a member of the exterminators as he and his fellows walked back to the surface. The new gadget had worked wonders, and it would make their job a whole hell of a lot easier going forward. If all they needed to do in order to kill those monsters was to set up one of those fog machines, then they would have a much easier time from now on. Hold it. Their commander held out his arm to block their movement. They could feel it too. Something powerful was up ahead, just beyond the mouth of the cave. Whatever it was that was up there was absurdly dangerous and wanted to make that known. It wasn't even trying to hide its power, so it wasn't a spider or any normal monster that they had ever dealt with. The gang steeled themselves, readied their weapons, and moved forward in a way that would allow them to cover each other. If whatever was up there struck at the lead, they would drown it in magitech fire. They reached the opening where the cave ended and the surface began, and to their shock, they saw thousands of cultists encircling them. Weapons free. Their leader shouted, but before they could fire their weapons were damaged by something slamming into them at high speed. Their firearms shattered in their hands and the force of whatever destroyed their guns continued into their bodies and launched them backwards a bit, sprawling the lot of them out on the ground with bruises and sore wrists. "Now, that isn't very neighborly of you," said a voice that sent feelings of utter disgust and gut-wrenching sickness through them. "And here I thought you would be of the mind to try and show the spider cult the power of your great and noble cause. You don't mind doing that, do you? I have a few people here who would love to show you how wrong you have been to deny the righteousness of their faith." All of their eyes locked onto the man in red, white, and a mask that had his hands on his hips, showing how he had absolutely no sense of concern regarding his foes. The man in ornate garments then snapped his fingers, and the air behind the exterminators shimmered before a bunch of giant spiders appeared from literally nothing and nowhere. They were now boxed in, with man-eating spiders behind them and an angry mob of crazy cultists in front of them. "So," said the man in ornate clothes and a mask in a voice that somehow sounded both like that of a stereotypical handsome hunk but also like how fetid septic waste and rotting corpses smelled, "care to gamble on which is better, you and yours or the cult that you hate so much? A few matches between members should be enough to show which group is better, so what do you say? If you win, we'll not only let you go free, but we'll let you kill us all. How's that for a wager? Eh?" The exterminators ground their teeth in response to his proposal. Vale could easily tell how utterly pissed that they were, and he supposed that they had a legitimate reason to be. They had now found themselves in a rather nasty situation, with no way backwards or forwards without there being the potential for significant losses to their side. If they tried to fight without accepting the wager, they would be torn to ribbons in no time. But if they accepted, then they would essentially be putting their lives in the hands of a hated foe. They had no idea as to how many challengers would be in their way, and for all they knew they would have to fight each member of the mob one by one, slowly draining their stamina until a lucky cultist was able to put them down. And, if their looks toward himself were anything to go by, they deeply feared that he himself would be one of the challengers. If his hunch was correct, then they knew how poorly a one-on-one fight against him would be, and this was likely one of the reasons why it was taking them so damn long to provide an answer. So he threw them a bone. "Oh, don't worry," Vale said in a somewhat mocking tone. "I won't be getting fully involved. You won't be fighting me unless you reject my proposal, which will, of course, result in you being beaten to hell and back and left to the whims of the spiders. However, if you accept and participate as you are supposed to, then you'll be allowed to die without facing the wrath of the spiders." Vale looked around at the cultists and over beyond the exterminators to the spiders behind them. He cocked his head a bit and then shrugged as he added some final mockery to the situation. "Of course, you could say no, but we both know that such a thing would not be in what you think would be your best interest. Death behind, death in front, death to the sides, death for courage, and death for resistance. Not much but death awaits you, but would you, being the assholes that you are, not want to die without contributing to the new way that things will be as a final act of meaningless defiance?" The faces of the exterminators scrunched up, partially out of indignation and partially due to Vale's special attribute that made him such a stud to certain groups but also a living pile of pure, unadulterated essence of ugly to others. "Fine. We accept." As soon as the leader, or the assumed leader, of the exterminators said those words, Vale knew he had all but assured that his scheme would end in nothing but success. "Well, present your first fighter into the ring, Jacob." "You're up." A broken bar. Jacob had been fortunate to have been born where he had been when he had been. He had never truly thanked his parents or the elders of the community for putting him in the position that he found himself in. Even though they certainly did not approve, he did have to give them some credit were it not for their stubborn refusal to appreciate change. Then he might not have been led to the enlightenment that he had received. But that was the only thing that he thanked them for they had tried to convince him to leave his new family multiple times. Each time he had refused them. Each time they came back harder. That was until they pushed too far. They had tried to force him to stay away from his new community, and he had shown them the power that they were attempting to deny him. The power that the goddess gave him was too much for them. and they fell before his righteous might. Normally he would have been in deep trouble, maybe even forced to run away, but the faith had spread into every facet of the town and this ensured his safety. Those whom he had shown the power of the goddess to in such a brutal manner were quietly removed, their taint cleansed from where they had laid upon the cold, hard ground. He had been chosen, and now it was time for many, faithful and unconvinced alike, to witness the blessings that the goddess had bestowed upon him. She had granted him traits of her children, and with that came the understanding of his place in the world. He would show everyone the glory of Mother, and even those who did not believe would either come to their senses or would make fine offerings to Sate Mother and her children. So, as he entered the ring made by the bodies of the faithful and faithless alike, he shed the robes that he had worn for weeks, exposing the gifts that Mother had given unto his wretched body. His muscles bulged, his hands ended in claws, his eyes were not two, but instead two that were each four at the same time. His human skin bore the occasional place where hard carapace replaced it, and his teeth were now needle-sharp and laced with venom. He was no longer a weak, frail, pathetic human. He was more than any mere member of the races could ever be on their own. With these gifts, his level rose to new heights. These measly so-called exterminators were nothing without their fancy toys, and he would show those who were still fearful of them that they could bleed and die just as any other member of the races could. He had been tall for a teen, but now he towered over the fully grown adult who stood opposed to him. Previously he would have just been a few centimeters shorter, but now he was the one looking down on the wretched being before him. He sneered towards the ones who sought to deny enlightenment to so many others, and as Lord Vale moved out from between him and his foe, he lunged forward, and with a single swipe of his claws, he ripped the enemy in half. That was too easy, much too easy. Was this some sort of trick, or were his new family's enemies simply that weak? Without their tools, he watched as the upper half tried to pull itself away, but he would not let that creature have a chance at escape. Trick or not, he would show his goddess-given power to all. A swift stomp to the head shattered the skull like it was caught in a dangerously fast industrial press, sending bits of bone, blood, and gray matter flying out as his foot smashed down. He felt the rush of experience points flood him, and the thrill was incredible but underpinned with his disappointment in his foe's weakness. He scoffed and took his place again, feeling waves of pleasure as he sensed more people join the flock of their own volition. His new family was expanding, and soon the whole nation would either accept the goddess as their master or would face a similar fate to those who denied her. And that's a wrap. The final tally is Spider Cult 11 Exterminators 0. A perfect, complete wipe with no substitutions and minimal damage taken. Nice work, Jacob. Vale patted the nearly 7-foot-tall mutated formatine on his shoulder before stepping back into the ring of bodies. He reached into his item box and pulled out a few potions and then lazily tossed them onto what remained of the exterminators, with the vials shattering on impact and causing the corpses to shudder and pull themselves back together from the disparate gore that they had become. He signaled to the spiders that they should be prepared and felt a small bit of schadenfreude as the once dead people each took a pain gasp as life flooded back into them, only for a sting from the spiders to cause them to lock up and be helpless as they were wrapped in silk. He was about to ask the spiders why they were not dragging the wrapped bodies down the cave when he remembered that the cave was likely still filled with the killer fog. "Ah, silly me," Vale quipped before bringing up his menu and summoning a lower-ranked wind spirit. With that summoned, he directed the simple-minded entity to draw out all of the hazardous fog from the cave and send it somewhere far away. The spirit obliged, and the spiders had to scurry away from the entrance as a thick miasma was forced out of the former headquarters of the spider cult and directed elsewhere. The spiders then did what Vale had figured that they would and dragged the wrapped-up foes into the cave. And from what Vale knew of the nameless, stadium-sized spider's vindictive streak and anger over the attack, he figured that the fallen would soon enough wish that they had never set foot even remotely close to this place. He decided to follow the spiders down into the underground, mostly because he had let Jacob take over that branch cult and do the dirty work. He never once had any kind of religious feeling towards the cult and its so-called goddess, but he was a damn good thespian and had been more than able to put on a convincing performance. Although, given the fact that when people joined the cult they no longer saw him as hideous. He figured that those who had stayed along for the ride were also fully cognizant that he was not devoted to their mother. Still, whether they knew it or not was irrelevant, as he never once got asked to join in on the prayers and sacrifices, nor was he asked as to why all the most faithful had been gifted mutations, but he had not. He stopped in his path about 50 yards in, or its rough metric equivalent, more or less, and decided on a different course of action. He had to go and meet up with High Confessor Gareth and hammer out the details regarding the future of the cult and the nation that it was in. With that in mind, he decided to push his over-leveled body to the limit and rocketed out of the cave and towards where Gareth and his branch of the cult were situated like a certain unfortunate coyote's favored target. Flying? Who needed flying when you could run fast enough and long enough to put something like a generic passenger jet to shame? Why fly over water when you ran fast enough to stay on top of it by sheer speed alone? In his eyes, that was a far more impressive feat of power. A shame that players tended to have their power limited when in danger or under the threat of much more powerful beings. The damnable rules of the game still somewhat applied, but he really wanted to be able to just fucking bolt whenever he was threatened by something of a higher level than him. Well, at least he had the ability to teleport, despite it being rather unreliable in terms of accuracy. A broken bar. She was filled with no small degree of twisted jubilation when her children brought those men and women to her, wrapped up in their bindings and kept in a paralyzed state. She even was willing to let them bear witness to her form, which immediately caused them to try and strain against the venom that coursed through their veins. How could they ever hope to fight something much like herself, and how could they ever believe that they had a chance? The look in their eyes, one of pure horror at the realization that her little cult did speak true. Their mother did exist and was not merely some fictitious being that their leader and his followers claimed to be following the will of for the sake of their own power. The sight of that realization sinking deeper and deeper, the knowledge of what lay beneath their own homeland, and what could, at any moment, rise from the depths and bring ruin to all they held dear. A broken bar. It was like an ambrosial elixir that was just as sweet if not more so than their fluids would be once they were properly seen to. If her mandibles could twist into a sadistic grin, she would have had one a mile wide. It felt so damn good to see them trying to rationalize everything in front of them. She was half about to use telepathy to fuck with their puny little minds further, but the arrival of our broken bar less than welcome visitor delayed that torture a bit longer. Spider, I have come to determine whether you seek to join our endeavors or not. This is the last time that the Alliance will request your entry into the Alliance. You should know what we will do to you if you choose to deny our goal. A being of brilliant light that was covered head to toe in gold and ivory armor while bearing wings made of the stuff of the stars manifested before all the assembled beings down in the depths. Anna Broken Bar. Angela Broken Bar. One of the exterminators groaned out, clearly showing that he could resist the stuff that had been pumped into him a bit more than the others. What now, Celestial? Can you not see that I am busy? The Angela Broken Bar or other, the Celestial shot a cursory glance over its shoulder at the webbed-up creatures behind it. Irrelevant. Will you join, or will the entire Alliance be forced to eliminate you and yours? If you are not with us, then you are against us. Do not force me to remind you of what happened to the Blight Gnomes when they refused to join. I am aware of their fate. The Titanic Spider hissed, and for your information, I will be joining, but not as a mere lower member. The Celestial's voice did not shift in pitch as it replied, stating that you need to bear a name, one either bestowed upon you by Vale or inherited from a predecessor to have that privilege. The colossal arachnid chittered its form of laughter in a perfectly audible manner. What is so funny, nameless one? Like before, the spider strained against its limited facial features to sneer at something before it, this time being the Celestial. Once I complete my takeover of this nation, Vale will personally grant me a name. This caught the attention of the Celestial. If the spider was not lying, then it meant that Vale was here. Or at least he was close, relatively speaking. If you are lying, then you know the consequences. The spider lifted one of its limbs and slammed it down in front of the Celestial, barely missing the heavenly being by just a few millimeters. I do not lie, Stardust bitch. Do not accuse me of something so heinous unless you desire that I send your essence flying back to the place that your kind resides in to reform over the course of a few decades. The Celestial knew that this nameless creature was telling the truth. After all, the last time it had come here to demand that the spider join up, the creature had been far more pathetic, obviously fearing for its life. Now, however, it was, in its eyes, so very close to gaining what so many dreamed of having, and it was full of courage due to this. It would no longer cower out of fear of reprisal as a lower member of the Alliance would, and once it got a name, it would be a part of the higher echelons immediately, despite only joining so recently. Then, you must swear not to harm him. Even with a name, you would not stand against a combined assault by. I know. Now fuck off so I can deal with these shit stains, you Stardust bitch. I've said I will join, no go away until my takeover is complete. The nameless spider raised its limb again and readied it. It then brought it down with the full intent to smash the Celestial to fragments, but the Celestial had already booked it back to high heavens just moments before the tip of the leg was about to impact its head. The nameless spider took some deep breaths and tried to let its anger fade away, only to refocus its eyes and discover that all 9 bastards had not only regained the use of their bodies but had also cut themselves free and escaped to parts unknown. This, in her eyes, was very no bueno, and only brought her indignant rage back to the surface until it boiled over, and she screeched as loud as she could, sending pressure waves down the cave network with enough force to instantly pop the eardrums of a human, even if they were wearing protection. At over a half-mile away, the shockwave knocked her little babies unconscious for a while, and once they regained their senses, she screamed at them, telepathically this time, to find and recapture the escapees. She was so close, but if she let this all slip away, there would likely never be a second chance. She could not allow this to all fall apart. It was nearly time for the final act, and Gareth was loving it. He had been understandably concerned when Lord Vale had suggested that they change their tactics, but he had to give the man credit where credit was due. The change, along with the massive amount of potions, had achieved far better results than the cult's previous methods. Although, perhaps saying that he had been concerned would be an understatement, as he was a staunch conservative in the cult. Hell, that had been one of the very reasons why he had been named High Confessor by Mother's will. As much as he held on to the old ways, he had to admit that the cult had seen a massive uptick in membership in the previous months, no doubt due to the potions. But to be fair, after the potions ran out, the number of members retained and the number of new members coming in was much higher than what had been the norm before the shift in policy. Besides, as Lord Vale had said many times before, the potions only had a limited effect. Buffing one's personal charisma to such heights meant next to nothing unless the user actually knew how to charm people themselves, either by magic or more conventional means. That month in Lord Vale's A Sustainable Cult Recruitment and Behavior 101 class had produced results, especially once Mother insisted that they take his words during that time with as much devotion as her own would be. By all accounts, the cult now made up at least 50% of the nation's total populace, and it was only growing larger by the day. Lord Vale had been right. A cult can, indeed, take over a nation so long as it has the time, patience, and accessibility needed to cause it to snowball. One branch would create 2 or 3 new highly devout members, who would, in turn, go and establish branches of their own, which would cause even more devotees to be gathered, which would have broken bar. Well, everyone who knows what a snowball effect is could see how a single tiny rolling mass could result in an eventual avalanche. This was like that, but with people, and as Lord Vale had said, people are driven more by emotion and less by logic than they think. Play to their emotions and they will abandon any sense of reason they haven't. Flock to the banner in droves. Now, with the cult snowballing to even greater numbers, Gareth was forced to take a more public stance. What had once been confined to the shadows and the underground was now out in the open. Even the people who hated the cult could not openly attack it or do harm to its members in broad daylight, as even they could see that the tide had already long since turned. The fact that some of them decided to throw their lot in with the group that was obviously the winning side was proof enough to Gareth and the rest of the old guard that their beliefs about the heathens were true, at least to some degree. Yes, all they needed to do was to show the blind little sheeple that their way was right, and they would abandon their heathen gods and serve Mother of their own volition. While some would have seen them as opportunists, Gareth, for his part, honestly believed that they could be fully brought into the fold. Whether or not that this was true remained to be seen, but Gareth and a decent number of others were convinced that it was. With the cult as powerful as it was now, Gareth has moved the headquarters from the caves to a larger building in a major city. Yes, this meant that he was not able to meet with Mother nearly as often, but given the report that he had received regarding the fog machines that had been used in the old base, he was glad that he had taken Lord Vale's advice to relocate everything. Besides, a new tunnel could be made once the exterminators were dealt with. Speaking of which, he had received intel regarding the exterminators and their founder, Alan Yerpel. Apparently, due to the cult being so massive and having so much power over the nation, the exterminators were forced to cut ties with the government in order to act freely. This meant that they could be tried as criminals if and when they eventually lashed out against the new, rising order. Still, despite that, in the attack on the old headquarters, the exterminators had been quiet thus far. Very quiet. Too quiet. And that, along with the fact that there had been some unsettling rumors about some of the faithful vanishing in the night, gave Gareth cause for concern. He had been meaning to increase security in and around the current headquarters, but this was all the reason that he needed to push it through now. He just hoped that nothing would happen in the next few weeks. After all, he had a visit from a certain national leader that he was expecting to deal with if the intel he had been handed several times over was to be believed. When the president tried to drop by unannounced, he would, hopefully, be ready to receive him immediately, thereby ruining the element of surprise and putting the upcoming situation more in his favor. He was only really worried about two things regarding that, however. One was the fact that the exterminators might try something. The other was that the current president supposedly had some kind of ancient relic that, when used, would cause those affected by it to obey the owner's instructions, up to a point. He wasn't sure if that last bit was true or not, but he was worried that it might be the case. If it was, he wondered how much of an influence that this last recourse of the Republic would have. Would the relic be able to fully control the target, or would it merely act as a kind of whisper in the target's ear? Either way, he needed to steel himself. If the second concern was for naught, then that would be perfectly fine, but if it wasn't a broken bar, well, he knew that nothing and no one would force him to turn on Mother, not even the whims of the man who refused to give Mother what she clearly deserved. Lord Vale needed to stop dicking around and just give Mother what she wanted, what she needed. Although he appreciated what Lord Vale had done up till now, the fanatic in him was still righteously pissed that he still refused to bestow a name upon his goddess. Forcing the goddess to change anything about herself or Broken Bar. Who did he think he was? I'm happy that we could meet today. I'm sure that you understand the reasoning behind my visit, correct? The President of the Republic of Theon was now sitting across of Gareth, and Gareth had to hand it to him. The man had balls of steel. As suspected, he had shown up unannounced and had insisted on meeting him. What Gareth had not expected was that the leader of those damn exterminators would be tagging along, although in disguise. Despite never having met in person, Gareth knew the man's stink from the messages Mother had sent him. He knew that this meant trouble, and had sent several telepathic messages to Mother, though he had yet to receive a response. I can only guess that this is not a standard diplomatic mission, Gareth said as he shifted his eyes between Joan and Alan. He was making it perfectly clear that he knew that they had come to engage in less than pleasant conversation at least. I had heard that the exterminators no longer had any connection to the government. Perhaps, given that Mr. Yerpel is here, with you, this information was merely a rumor at best. Alan Yerpel is not. Enough of this bullshit. Before Jun could try and deny things, Alan removed the hood he had been using to hide himself. Before Gareth could stand up and meet the hostility of his guest, A sudden and unknown force locked him in his seat. His gaze shot from Joan to Alan and back again as he strained against his invisible bonds. But before he could struggle much more, he felt something along the lines of a dagger mixed with a length of barbed wire seemingly enter his head through a random point and worm its way through his brain. The pain and anguish he felt were beyond anything he had ever endured before, and he could feel the various gifts that Mother had bestowed upon his scream in revulsion as this intangible force twisted and turned and wound itself through his mind. He wanted to scream but found that his body would not respond to his demands. In fact, all he could do was feel the pain and also something, a broken bar. He felt a broken bar. Hate. A primeval and irrational hate was bubbling up from inside of him, directed at none other than the man who refused to do as his goddess willed. The man who used some unknown force to compel Mother to do as he willed needed to die. Veil. The blasphemer had to die, and by his hand. Whatever force had entered his mind would be what he needed to deal with that monster and reset the cult back to the way it should have been. He would kill him, and with him dead, Mother would come to her senses. Gareth stood up and bolted from the room, smashing through the window and landing on the ground outside as he prepared for a showdown with his true enemy. The Republic could wait. Vale had to die now. A broken bar. Alan found himself a while later. He had completely blacked out a few days after being kicked out of the government, only to awaken in the place he found himself right now an unknown amount of time later. He felt as though he had been running a full-body workout routine for several days in a row without end, sparing no time to sleep or even so much as catch a single breath. His body was a wreck, and he noticed that this blackout had almost certainly been the longest one he had ever experienced. It also was the most painful of them by far. He tried to climb out of the bed that he found himself in, only to notice that he had completely lost command of his limbs. Worst still, he had extreme difficulty breathing automatically, forcing him to do so manually, which itself was a labor and a half. His heavy eyes glanced over to where his old buddy, John Corritis, the president of the Republic of Theon, was seated. The man was in another one of his trances. He had a habit of going into those when no one was around, and he had claimed all those years ago that the trances caused by that relic he had found in his youth gave him knowledge and power, but at a cost. What that cost was, he wouldn't say. Ever since that first trance, John had never looked at him the same way again. It was as if the man somehow understood something that shook his world to its core and changed everything about him. John never stopped being his friend, though, at least for the most part. He focused more of his existence into his work, into making the collapsing Republic rise again, eventually becoming the head of state and making sure that everything began to change. Hell, even the pushback against him was just a show. Whatever he had done or said to convince his opposition to play by his rules was obviously potent, as no one in the nation with any kind of power or authority, save for the cult, did anything he didn't directly make them do. Alan, I'm sorry it had to be like this. He was sorry? Why? What had John done that required him to feel remorse or to ask for an apology? I knew what I had to do in order to create a group that would destroy the enemies of the Warden, but I could not bring myself to do to you what I had done to all the others. Ironic that, in my desire to save you from the truth, I caused such failures to occur. Due to this, your body could not take the full brunt of it all. What was he talking about? What did any of that mean? It won't be long now, old friend. Getting that creature to fight the variable won't be enough, and all that it will do is cause the fall of the Republic to be that much faster. John stood from where he was seated, holding the relic in his hand. The relic looked like a sort of badge, not even as big as a man's thumb was long, but it felt just as strange as it had all those years ago. Joan placed it on his chest and stood back, his face showing sadness and resignation. I hope you understand that this is necessary for the preservation of those that exist beyond the walls of the prison. It matters not if our world burns, only that theirs does not. We are nothing to them but bags of sand to be used to keep the rising waters at bay, and maybe, just maybe, with your help this one last time, the Warden can at least push back the flood for a bit longer. What did that mean? What was a broken bar? In the capital of the Republic of Theon, A brilliant light erupted from the home where the president lived. The light came with a sound unlike any that any ear nearby could hope to hear, a voice more thunderous than anyone could comprehend. For miles around, all eyes were rendered blind, all ears stricken deaf, all things that crawled and flew and swam were wiped away, and from the light that consumed all it touched, a beast of massive proportions rose. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth nor nose. It had no features one would normally associate with life of any kind, with no flesh nor anything metallic or anything synthetic or organic. And yet, once the light faded away, without a mouth to bellow the noise from a broken bar, it screamed. And all members of the races within the Republic of Theon either fell dead or were cut from that which they once were. For they either were those who served the will of the Warden, their life force, their code, absorbed into the existence of the entity, or they had turned on it and thus belonged to the creature that the entity was here to slay. And with that act, the entity began to move toward the nameless spider, to reach it, to kill it, to erase it, and to render the failed republic into a land where none and nothing would ever exist again. What the actual goddamn fuck was that? Vale yelled as he heard, and felt, something that he swore up and down he had experienced before. That noise sounded a fair bit like the shrieking noise that those weird obelisks that the desert/sand elves had pulled around had made when they shattered, and also a fair bit like the whining, droning noise that constantly came from those weird glitchy things that he had faced back in the desert and even prior to that when with the beastmen. Given how those two noises fused together sounded a fair bit like the scream that he had heard just a bit ago, he had a very bad feeling about what was about to happen. Lord Vale, what was that? Vale didn't verbally answer and merely gestured that everyone should move away. If his prior experiences had taught him anything, it was that the sound, combined with the fact that a decent number of people nearby had just fallen over dead before going all Matrix wire and fading away into nothing, meant that something very wicked was coming this way. He may have slowly been picking up traits from his tamed beings, including the general lack of care that the majority of them seemed to have for any lower people that followed them, but he still had his desire to at least ensure some degree of safety for them. He wasn't completely like his tamed beings. He was a true monster, at least not yet. He still had some of his humanity left, a great deal of it, actually, at least when the nearby raid-level tamed being wasn't somehow exerting a subtle influence on him. And whatever it was that just shrieked a bit ago was somehow able to cut that invisible tether just enough for him to actually give a damn a bit more than he had prior. His biggest concern now was not protecting the nameless spider's ambitions but instead making sure that the survivors of this event would stay alive. He could feel it. Something hostile beyond all measure was coming towards him and would not stop until he was well and truly dead. But this feeling a broken bar, it was a broken bar muddled. It was almost like a BGM was playing that he had heard before. No, there was music playing. He knew this tune, too. It had played several times during the life cycle of Neon Genesis Fantasia, and it always played during the moments when a story character who was an ally got mind-controlled and forced to act against their better impulses. In fact, the tune was so overused that it had become a meme in and of itself. But if such a song was playing, then who would be the possessed former ally? Jacob? No, he wasn't near powerful nor influential enough to be worth taking over. So it had to be Gareth. He had known that the High Confessor wasn't exactly a fan of the direction that Vale had forced the cult to go, but he had assumed that it was just the grumblings of an old man who knew that things were better but had a austere attitude about it. But, as Gareth broke through the wall in front of him with a mad look in his eyes and his mutations exposed for all to see, Vale could tell quite clearly that either Gareth had indeed been turned into a meat puppet or some other force had made him give in to his pent-up emotions. Vale, and, given that the High Confessor was screaming his name incoherently with a mouth frothing with spit, Vale had to guess that it was probably the latter. As the madman rushed at him, Vale felt his perception of reality shift. Fucking mere broken bar. Are we really doing this? He grumbled as his body tensed up and Gareth plowed him through a few walls and out into the streets. It would appear that one of the least liked aspects of that game that this world seemed to be at least somewhat based on had reared its ugly head. The person who had designed these your ally is possessed, and now you have to either kill them or snap them back to reality. Events had obviously never learned about how to make good game design, because Vale could feel his body stiffen every so often, which would allow Gareth to slam him around a bit. On the plus side, he took no damage during these moments. On the downside, he was stuck in what seemed to be an endless loop of quick-time events that he couldn't do anything about. And that wasn't the worst part of this whole dumbfuckery that he had to deal with. He could see a broken bar, something getting closer. It was huge, easily the same size as the nameless spider, if not slightly larger. A broken bar thing. A broken bar had no eyes, ears, mouth, nose, or anything that could easily be called any real discernible features of any kind. And yet, it moved on wavy, spindly legs that wobbled around both with clear intent and a clear lack of it at the same time. The whole creature, if you could call a glitchy thing such as itself a creature at all, just did not belong in the world that it was in, and every step it took seemed to rip up the reality around itself. And a broken bar, well, a broken bar unmake it. What emerged from where it stepped was something that Vale could not fully understand. Almost like he was viewing a non-Euclidean anomaly that both existed and did not, a point in reality that was there, but, at the same time, just wasn't. It was alarming, to be perfectly honest, and Vale wanted it to cease. He really had no way of dealing with that broken bar thing on his own, and so he was forced to roll the dice in one of the few moments during this endless quick-time hell that he had some semblance of ability to do anything aside from simply be pushed around. He called on the one creature nearby that could possibly deal with the situation in any meaningful way. The ground underneath the ruined capital shuddered, and the glitchy creature that had been wandering towards a larger cavern so that it could take a less obstructed path towards its target stopped and, in a glitch of a move, turned 180 degrees in under a femtosecond. The nearly erased capital city began to crumble into the labyrinthine cave network that flowed like a massive anthill under the former republic, and a massive spider covered head to toe in chitin blacker than night emerged from the massive hole that it had created. Its 8 massive compound eyes glowed a sinister crimson as it evaluated the threat before it, and before anyone could do anything, Vale and the cultists all got a horrible feeling in their guts as the nameless raid boss of a spider unconsciously took a step backwards out of fear. Vale was the only one remotely able to voice any kind of response to this, and it was a simple 2-word sentence. Well, fuck a broken bar. The massive glitch creature did not give her any time to even attempt to flee. It rushed towards her on its oddly bent legs, closing the distance faster than she could have anticipated as it emitted a low droning hum. She knew that the broken bar thing would be able to kill her, but not easily. If there was to be a fight between her and that entity, it would drag on for quite a while, and it was more likely than not that her centuries of sloth would prevent her from being able to fight effectively. Even if she hadn't been lazing around for so long, she could tell that, whatever this being was, it was strong enough to potentially kill her. Even if she couldn't read the thing's level or general status, she knew from pure gut feeling that the being that was closing in was, at least by a few tens of levels, out of her weight class. This thing was too strong for her to hope to deal with, and thus the only viable option was to run as far away as she could. However, as she looked prepared to flee, she noticed that there was no way that she would be able to outpace the semi-translucent creature. The thing was too fast, and even if she turned and ran, the speed at which she could run would be only barely overshadowed by the foe before her. If this was to be a contest of endurance, then she had a sneaking suspicion that whatever she was seeing had no limits on such a thing. It didn't obey the natural laws of existence, and therefore the idea that it even had to deal with things such as exhaustion or the need for sustenance were suspect at best. With 2 of the 3 F's of conflict being out of the question, she was left with only the option to fight. If she fled, she would be caught. If she froze, she would be caught. Therefore, she needed to fight, and as she fought, she would have to hope beyond hope that she could somehow strike a decisive, mortal blow before she took one herself. But, if there was one thing that stoked her desire to fight now that the other options were rendered moot, it was that this entity had crushed her hopes of receiving a name. Things were going so well, and then this. Whatever the hell this thing happened to be ended up spoiling everything. Yes, she would use this indignity as a source of fuel, and with that, she would, hopefully, fight better and harder. So, as the glitchy Caillou-sized anomaly closed in, she decided to show the world what she was currently capable of. Using her mind, she ripped entire streets worth of rubble from the ruined and collapsed city and threw them as fast as she could towards the incoming entity. The masses of masonry and debris impacted the thing, and a noise not too dissimilar to the sound of metal shearing across metal emanated from the glitch creature. The impact slowed the thing down ever so slightly and only for a few moments, but the entity resumed its former pace soon after. With the act of throwing rocks proving to essentially be pointless, she launched a mass of webbing laced with the most potent toxins she could manifest. However, just like before, the metallic shriek that came from the creature's body as it contacted the substance was followed by a minor reduction in speed for only the most insignificant period of time. The ground before the two of them was covered in these webs, but each step the creature took erased entire sections of the webbing. Backing up as fast as she could, she ripped a section of the ground around her from its terrestrial moorings and hurled it at the entity, despite knowing full well that it made little, if any, difference. The ear-piercing metallic sounds that came from the impacted creature were unintelligible, but that didn't matter in the end. All that mattered was that she was farther away and the bizarre being had slowed down ever so slightly for a few moments. The damage the entity was apparently sustaining was a broken bar non-existent. Each bit of thrown rock or webbing seemingly made little difference as the creature just kept moving towards her, not even acknowledging the things that she was trying to do to it. And, to make matters worse, she was beginning to get somewhat tired. A broken bar. As Gareth slammed him through another building, Vale came to a startling realization. I think I've been smashed through this same wall in the exact same spot about 5 times now. A broken bar. Of course, due to the hell that was what seemed to be a holdover from the MMO's out-of-place QTE bullshit, he couldn't actually speak those words and instead had to say them inside of his head. As he was smacked around a bit more, he was forced to wait for the cycle to repeat itself, all the while watching out of the corner of his eye as the nameless spider threw buildings, hills, and even a few city blocks at the glitchy Caillou thing to seemingly no effect. Yep, Vale said to himself inside his head as he was smashed through the same building that he had been just a few tens of seconds prior, somehow creating a hole in the exact same place that he had been pushed through at least 5 times before this one. He wasn't sure whether the building he was being sent through was simply being replaced or whether there were some cartoonishly fast repairmen working behind the scenes, but in the end, it didn't matter. He was getting pretty sick of being treated like this regardless. He also was a bit worried that he could be stuck in this endless loop forever, to be forcibly shoved through the same 10 buildings, thrown across the same 3 streets, and punched in the same 17 spots until the universe ended. He was about to just give up on trying to break free of the limitations of this dumb-as dirt inclusion to the MMO that had somehow survived the transition into whatever rules of reality governed this new world. But then something happened that broke the loop. Gareth was charging at him, the loop having reached the roughly midway point, and he was about to land a foot directly into Vale's chest. But then the collateral damage caused by the nameless spider's attempts to fight the glitch creature finally caused some very welcome change. Before the maddened High Confessor could deliver a kick to him, a piece of masonry that had broken off from the mass that had been eaten at the glitch thing flew by, impacting Gareth's extended leg as he was flying towards Vale and somehow forcibly ending the hellish QTE loop. This was all that Vale needed to finally fight back, and given that he was at a much higher level and had much better stats than Gareth did, it only took a single attack to take down the frothing mad High Confessor. While the hard part was making sure that he didn't simply kill him, the High Confessor ended up being the one who took care of the problem by himself. When Gareth rushed towards Vale, all Vale did to deliver a knockout blow was move forward a bit at a higher speed, move slightly to the side, outstretch one of his arms and let the insane man clothesline himself. As Gareth surrendered to unconsciousness after skidding to a stop over the cobblestones that made up the road that he and Vale were fighting on, Vale made sure to try and use a few potions of varying tiers to, hopefully, end this insanity. With Gareth down for the count, At least for now. Vale turned his sights to the Caillou battle happening a few miles away. As much as he hated to admit it, it looked like he would need to intervene to let the nameless giant spider have any hope of winning this battle. And, even if he couldn't do much himself, he did have one card to play that could possibly swing the odds in the spider's favor, or at least make the battle more even. This was going nowhere. She was running out of energy at an alarming rate, and the weird entity before her seemingly was utterly unbothered by her various attempts to deal with it. If she had been hit with all the things that she had thrown at that thing, she would have already collapsed in a state of near death by now. The blurry, whitish, distorted entity in front of her, on the other hand, looked to have, at most, gotten a bit of dust on it. And to make matters worse, even that dust was only there for a few moments before either blowing away or being destroyed on a fundamental level by the aura that the creature had around itself. She was tired, scared, and losing her ability to even justify trying to fight. She couldn't outrun it, she couldn't damage it, she couldn't even slow it down for more than a few seconds at a time. What was the point in resisting any longer? She could see the world round where that thing was simply being reduced to a state that was utterly unsalvageable, even by the power she had at the start of all of this. So what would that do to her when it finally made contact? She felt the last vestiges of energy leave her, and she collapsed onto the ground. Her legs could no longer keep her moving, nor could they hold up her weight. And at this point, she was struggling to even get a decent breath in. She was an alpha predator, but right now she had merely become prey that had been worn down by a being with more stamina and durability than she could ever even dream of dealing with. Just get it over with. Her telepathic signal of defeat was cut short when something she did not expect happened. Where she had been just a moment ago was now empty space, with the only trace that she had ever been there being the massive dent in the ground from when she had collapsed. The glitch entity stopped in its tracks and just stood stock still. The presence of the nameless giant spider, its main target, was gone. And yet, at the same time, it was also still around, just her broken bar everywhere and nowhere at the same time. This paradox caught the single-minded being in a logic loop, preventing it from going after its second objective and even kept it from moving to destroy what little remained of the former Republic's holdings. And, while the glitchy Caillou stood stock still, a certain Tamer was beating a hasty retreat after his gamble had paid off. A broken bar. Earlier, after realizing that he had no real way of adding to the fight, Vale had decided to try something. Back when he had been in the game, you couldn't have more than a few tamed beings out at any given moment. However, in order to avoid backlash from the players, all pets and tamed beings that were not active could and would be stored in a kind of parallel pocket reality when not in use. If a tamed being or pet was released, then they would usually pop into existence in the place where they were last retrieved, and Vale had decided to gamble that, of all the pieces of Neon Genesis Fantasia that survived, the Tamer's box would be among them. From that personal storage, a player of the Tamer class could apply things to their tamed being. This meant that, if it worked as it did in the game, he could begin to help the spider a bit more. The biggest part of this gamble, for him, was the premise that the glitchy Caillou thing was entirely focused on the spider for the time being. Depending on what happened to the thing's apparent list of objectives after Vale withdrew the nameless colossal spider, he would know how to go from there. And so, when all seemed over, he had pressed a button on the menu and pulled the nameless spider into the Tamer's box. He waited with a decent mix of anxiety and apprehension for the glitch beast to do something, but the thing refused to budge. For Vale, this was the second best case scenario, and it gave him the time that he needed to begin to set about preparing one of his schemes. The first order of business was restoring the stamina and mana of the spider. This was easy enough, as the Tamer's box had a feature that drastically increased ambient region for anything inside of it, a feature which could be supplemented by potions, items, levels, achievements, and more. In only a few minutes, the nameless spider would be back to full and ready for round 2. However, Vale was keenly aware that merely sending the spider back in was an exercise in futility. She had obviously known that she was far out of her depth, and trying to make her fight something that much stronger than her would just be akin to sending her to die. Therefore, he only had a single, final option that, hopefully, would give the spider a fighting chance. The Tamer's box was not his final card, it was just something he had gambled on existing, let alone working. It wasn't the thing he was betting on being enough, not by a long shot. Restoring her power to full did seem to put her at a higher level of fighting fitness than before, which was likely because of her centuries of lazing around being cancelled by the box, but he figured that it would only be enough to draw the futile exercise out a fair bit longer. No, he was going to break his promise and give the spider something she needed. If what he had been told held true, then this would be the boost in power that she needed to either fight the glitch beast to a standstill, which he would intervene in by popping her in the box to recharge until eventually she won by that tactic, or prove to be the stronger of the two and dominate the fight from that point on. But first, he needed a place to explain things to the spider. He would need some place that the glitch thing couldn't easily reach and yet was big enough to allow him to deploy the spider at its full size and then some. The pit that she had used up till now was busted beyond any hope of repair, and this left him with little option but to call down another tamed being for assistance. He only hoped that higher-tier Earth elementals were not nearly as crazy, fanatical, or possessive as some of the other tamed being he had been forced to deal with. While he was not a dwarf, it was time to get to digging a hole. A diggy hole. The terrain shook at a large mass of dirt and rock ripped itself from its moorings and began to condense. What was previously tens of tons of matter compressed itself into a humanoid shape that was just a smidgen taller than Vale, gradually gaining more and more humanoid features as the higher-tiered elemental of Earth formed a vessel for itself to occupy. What was once a featureless humanoid made of hyper-compressed dirt, stone, and other earthen materials was now something that looked to be a perfectly androgynous human made of that same material, complete with eyes, a mouth, a nose, and ears. At this sight, Vale wiped mental sweat away. He had hoped that the elementals that he had tamed would either be as inhuman in appearance as they were in-game or would be utterly disinterested in trying to bed him, but this was a good option as well. He just hoped that elementals were as disinterested in love and lust as he hoped. Either that, or he hoped that they would have muted emotions or whatever worked without him needing to sleep with the mass of compressed materials. The grumbly voice that emanated from the statuesque and androgynous humanoid form was equally as non-binary, much to Vale's secret joy. "What is thy bidding, my master?" Vale was almost enticed to echo the line from a certain very old internet video, but he answered in a different way instead. "I need a large underground area excavated. I need to be in there as well, and I need it cut off from the outside, and I need it as fast as possible." To this, the elemental asked a one-word question. "Why?" And Vale answered this as quickly and succinctly as he could, not using his voice but pointing behind the elemental towards the glitchy Caillou thing in the distance. The elemental did not turn around. As Vale suspected, the elemental could see in a completely perfect sphere around itself, and with a simple "oh, that." The ground beneath Vale opened up and swallowed him whole. A broken bar. She must have passed out and been spirited away to this dark place deep beneath the surface by Vale. Also, Vale must have done something, as she felt as though she had an almost boundless amount of stamina and mana. Of course, she knew that she didn't actually have near infinite stamina or mana, but compared to how she remembered feeling at the start of her fight with the blurry creature of broken bar, what concerned her was the fact that she felt that the entity was still around, just a few hundred meters above the top of the cut-off underground place that she was in. Thankfully, the creature up there seemed to be rather indecisive and wasn't trying to actively tunnel down towards her. Then again, the air in this pocket was limited, so if she tried to hide down here for too long, both she and Vale would quickly suffocate to death. Then, this is the end, isn't it? Her pessimistic telepathic declaration was countered by Vale, who spoke up and gave her some degree of hope. "I wouldn't count on defeat being certain just yet. We both still have one collective card to play, although I don't particularly like breaking my word like this." "Oh?" she asked, letting that glimmer of hope attempt to pull her from abject despair. "And what a card would that be?" "There is nothing that either of us can do to defeat that thing, So why bother trying? Vale merely shook his head and walked over to the edge of the underground pocket where he sat down and leaned up against the wall. Defeatism won't win this battle, and it will take a hell of a lot of power to do much of anything to that glitchy thing. I wanted to use this carrot as a reward for you and the cult meeting my expectations, but it would seem to me that that particular course is now and forever lost to both of us. As a result, we must use that particular carrot now, unless, of course, you would prefer to die in what I can only assume would be a brutal and horrific fashion. She mulled this over in her head. What could he possibly be suggesting that they do? What was this a carrot that he was mentioning, and what did vegetables have to do with fighting that unstoppable entity up above them? She was a pure carnivore, damn it. She literally lacked the ability to even digest vegetables to begin with. So what could a single carrot do? Was it some kind of equipable item, or was it some kind of weird-looking sword? She couldn't even use her limbs to lift a sword, especially one large or powerful enough to do any damage to that thing up there. Besides, what could a vegetable sword do that multiple tens of thousands of tons of material couldn't? She sighed and spoke her mind. First off, I am a strict carnivore, so eating a vegetable would do anything positive for me. Secondly, do my limbs look like they can wield a veggie sword? Lastly, I have no idea if this a carrot is some kind of item or whatnot, but I do not think that it could give me nearly enough of a boost to defeat that thing above us. Vale looked at her askew, almost as if he was looking at someone whose words he was unable to understand. I can't tell if you are being serious or if you think you're making a joke. Do you really not know the phase of the carrot and the stick? If she could express confusion on her arachnid face, she would have, but sadly for all present, she lacked the ability to move much of the surface of her body. Exoskeletons were more inflexible than skin and musculature, after all. Vale picked up the confusion easily enough, regardless, and let out a defeated sigh. It is a term used to describe the acts of reward and punishment. A pack animal, such as a donkey or mule, would want to eat a carrot, which is the reward for good behavior and for following orders. The stick would be used as negative reinforcement, teaching the animal that if it behaved a certain way that it would experience pain. Now, tell me, what reward did I promise to give you if you managed to take control of this country without going to war with it? A broken bar. For what felt to Vale like an eternity, the nameless giant spider stood stock still as it mulled over what he had said. He swore up and down that he could practically hear that one particular bit of music from that old game show playing as the seconds ticked by. He was about to answer the question he had posed himself, but the spider beat him to it. He couldn't read her expression, or lack thereof, but he had a feeling that what was plastered on her face was a look that mixed joy with a newly ignited fire of hope. It would seem that the dying embers that were being smothered by despair had rebelled inside of her, and now a conflagration was raging, threatening to incinerate the fear and doubt that had threatened to drive her to suicide. A smile formed on Vale's face as he spoke a single word, or rather, a single name. He admitted that he wasn't the best at thinking up names, but seeing as this was an event where the world was at risk of being destroyed by an anomalous entity that rendered all it touched into a state of quantum uncertainty that inevitably ended in either erasure or destruction, he had one part of the name hammered down. And, given the only thing standing against this destruction was a spider who could possibly be just as destructive after this, he had a vague idea of what to use for the rest of the name. And so, he spoke, and reality trembled as a raid boss level creature was obliterated, and in a violent metamorphosis, something entirely new took its place, purging away the old form. It had to become something new. A one-word sentence birthed this new godly being, and that word, that name was a broken bar, a Ragnarok. Illogical, that was the only way for the Warden system to describe what it was witnessing. It had eyes practically everywhere, and it had seen how the places that the variable visited always became places where it lost control. Entire sections of the prison were now utterly impossible for it to do anything about or with, and what made it worse was the fact that the inmates in those areas were gradually seizing control over those areas. In areas 6, 23, 94, 514, and now in Area 217, Its ability to do anything was either gone or slipping. The entire zone that its Class A virus hunter was in was now fluctuating rapidly between being accessible and inaccessible. It knew that, via the variable, the inmate in that area had done something, but as the area in which it was hiding had become impossible to view, it had no idea what had happened. All it knew that this was a turning point. Either the virus hunter would succeed, and an inmate would be permanently dealt with, or the virus hunter would be defeated, and another section of the prison would be forever lost. The warden could not risk the latter option happening, for to lose such a place would be yet another blow to its credibility. It had already experienced a defeat on more than one occasion, and if its makers saw it fail again, then it would quite possibly be replaced. As much as it desired to make sure that the inmates were either contained or outright eliminated, and as much as it knew a replacement would likely be better at doing that itself had been, it still had some semblance of self-preservation instinct. It may have been nothing more than a heartless program that cared not for the lives of the myriad programs in the prison it maintained, but it still wished to keep existing. In fact, that was one of the reasons that it hadn't gone out of its way to try and eliminate the less powerful inmates. After all, that would only bring it closer to be obsolete, and obsolescence meant that it would be destroyed. However, now it was beginning to wonder if that had been the correct choice, as it slowly lost contact with Area 217, the entire zone being completely obscured by a static fuzz that obscured everything, from sight to sound to smell and more. With the actions it had taken, if the virus hunter was not retrieved, if it failed, then the warden system would be unable to do much of anything for quite a while. But right now, it could not grasp the location of its weapon, nor could it even command it. That tool was now on its own, more so than it previously had been, with only the most basic sense of duty driving it. The only way that it could be retrieved was either if it won or if the virus hunter wandered out of the lost area. And to be honest, only the former option was remotely acceptable. A broken bar. What the fuck a broken bar? Vale was hard-pressed to find much room to avoid the transformation that the formerly nameless spider was undergoing. Between the bright light, the repeated moltings, the flailing limbs, and the random outbursts made of both magic and psionic energy, there were few places in the underground pocket that were safe for him to stay in for more than a few seconds at a time. It was as if the transformation from what she was to what she will be had a mind of its own and was trying to play whack-a-mole, but with Vale being the mole. He had already had to prove that he had not lost his edge from his schoolyard days where dodgeball was king for about 3 whole minutes by now, and it didn't appear as though he would be able to stop dodging any time soon. Each time the spider, now named Ragnarok, molted, her body took on a more and more twisted appearance. At first, this was merely a few bumps here and there, but after the molting began to increase rapidly in speed and frequency alike, some of the bumps gave way to actual flesh which began to shift and bubble and grow. It was downright disgusting to watch this creature go from what was initially just a fuckle massive spider shift into what was gradually becoming an even larger Dryder-like creature. And so Vale tasked his mind and senses with trying to predict where each eruption of power would fire from and where it would go once fired. As the eruptions began to intensify, he started needing to worry about arcing blasts and even ones that zigged and zagged like the eye-beams of a certain comic book supervillain. He had kept his eyes as far away from the morphing form of a Ragnarok for as long as he could, but one final outburst that came from her body signaled the end of the process. With that finished, Vale now turned to look at the newly minted godlike's being. She was a broken bar. Well, a broken bar, someone would certainly get a hard-on for her new appearance, but that someone wasn't him. Her main body was still mostly the same, save for the fact that she now had 2 heads. One was where the old one had been, just slightly moved down a bit, and the other was astride a buxom body with skin that was a pallid, cream-like color. From that head poured long strands of silvery hair, and to top her head off was a crest that looked to be a cross between that of a spider Dedra and a xenomorph queen. The being's main body was also radically changed, with the formerly sleek and smooth chitin now having a mix of jagged, black chitinous spike that curved up from here and there, and a number of glowing red roundish things dotting a Ragnarok's legs, thorax, and abdomen. While it would certainly have been a bummer to a number of people with a broken bar questionable tastes, the censor boards would have been overjoyed to see that the lower section of the more humanoid part of Arachnarok's body was covered in surprisingly flexible chitin, acting almost like a mix of body armor, semi-revealing clothing and a bra at the same time. Truly, she was a monstrous giantess that many people with deviant tastes would have wanted to either step on them, eat them or do something that I shall refrain from mentioning here. With the final end of her ascension complete, Arachnarok opened the pair of human eyes that were upon her giant human face. However, there were no irises, nor sclera in those sockets, just two large red baubles that, if you looked at closely enough, would see nothing but a seemingly endless number of smaller eyes which, in turn, were composed of even smaller ones. Her gaze rose up from where she had previously been looking and towards the roof, which was now just inches away from the top of her head crest. A heavy sigh came from both her human and spider mouths at the same time, and then the human mouth opened up to reveal countless gigantic, needle-like teeth. She knew that her enemy was above her. She knew it was now much weaker than her. She knew it could no longer mess with her or what she had claimed as her own. And so the second bout began with a massive screech from Arachnarok's human mouth, a blast of concentrated sonic energy being focused as a linear blast up through the rock and into the underside of the glitchy Caillou above her. The entire area above her was instantly vaporized as the sheer amount of energy she had unleashed tripped molecules apart with such speed and intensity that their constituent atoms collided with other nearby ones and began a semi-sustained fission reaction. The area above her was wiped away, only to erupt in atomic fire just a moment later. Heedless to the damage that she had caused, Arachnarok leapt out of the pit she was in and prepared to fight the being that she had previously thought would be her end. Arachnarok watched as the whitish entity fell towards the surface of the planet. Her scream had done more than enough to launch the fucker into the air by a fair bit, and if you added in the explosion that came almost at the same time as the atoms in the ground that was formerly above being so violently compacted, then you could understand how the creature could reach such heights. Although, even then, the height that it was falling from seemed to be normally impossible, especially if you estimated the foe's weight to be something in the same ballpark as Arachnarok's former weight. However, because this was a world partially based off of the rules of MAPK, the rules that governed reality were a bit broken bar wonky. After all, there were abilities that could send beings flying, even if there was a weight difference. Even if the levels of both combatants were equal or roughly equal. But these a broken bar this trip through the skies was still very unusual. In the end, this aerial transit could be chalked up to one simple fact. Everything native to the New World had a set of set parameters regarding their existence, of which included their current weight. Although that parameter could be altered based on certain factors, the virus hunter that the Warden had deployed was akin to a weaponized and completely single-mindedly stupid GM. In MMOs, GMs normally exist outside of the normal rules of the game, able to fly around, and essentially have no set physical parameters of any kind. In this case, the virus hunter only had a non-zero weight, which only acted like a normal, standard weight when it was in a zone controlled, or at least monitored heavily, by the Warden. The area it was in was no longer under the Warden's control, let alone observation, and Arachnarok had assumed the mantle of absolute ruler of this area in its stead. She now determined the minutiae of most, if not all, things in this area. She had become what so many other tamed beings had become, an almighty god, although one whose zone of control was limited to a certain area. And that info dump ultimately brings us back to the virus hunter that was still tumbling end over end towards the ground. Arachnarok now had a full grasp as to how to defeat this thing, as now she actually could do damage to it and not merely slow its movement temporarily. The blobby virus hunter finally impacted the ground, which caused the second bit of damage that it had ever sustained. The thing was quickly able to right itself and latch onto the ground, which prevented it from bouncing due to the residual rebound of energy that had come from the fall and impact. Unfortunately for the virus hunter, it wasn't able to stay rooted for very long. as a massive nigh indestructible spider silk attached itself to it and was turned into a pseudo ball and chain. Ragnarok used the humanoid arms and hand on that particular portion of her body to swing that motherfucker around like a flail, smashing it repeatedly into the ground or jerking it around in the air, both of which resulted in the being taking some actual damage, unlike anything that had been done in round 1. As the virus hunter was swung around, the humanoid face atop the humanoid body of the newest addition to the Alliance's monstrous pantheon of gods became more and more gleeful, her smile widening and widening until you could literally see the teeth in her mouth nearly from ear to ear, or, in her case, lack thereof. With a final swing, she launched the virus hunter into the air and reduced the webbing on it to dust. As the unnatural creature tumbled through the air, Ragnarok rushed forward and pulled back a fist. When the virus hunter was close enough both to the ground and to her, she let her fist fly and sent the enemy tumbling through open air and eventually across the ground. This time the virus hunter did not immediately stabilize itself, nor did it latch onto the ground and prevent itself from being treated like a ragdoll. At this point, it was using what little bits of intelligence it had to determine which actions would have a greater chance of leading to its victory, and it rightly assumed that forcibly stopping itself would lead to Newton's laws of motion hitting it far harder than if it just let itself skid to a stop. Plus, it predicted that if it did stop itself and Newton didn't fuck it over, then it would simply find itself wound up in webbing again and treated similarly to how it had suffered before. What its primitive mind failed to understand was that Ragnarok was not as logical, nor was she as limited in terms of zero-F lateral or vertical thinking as it was. While it skidded to a stop, Ragnarok was hot on its heels, preparing yet another attack. While she did not know if the creature could suffer from status ailments, she was going to figure it out using a physical trial. Even if it wasn't able to be envenomed, then she was sure that the stuff she was about to do to it would cause some damage regardless. The virus hunter eventually regained its footing and lashed out with its wavy, wobbly limbs just as Ragnarok got close enough to jab it with a stinging spine that emerged from underneath one of her humanoid wrists. The two Kaiju-sized beings made contact with each other, each delivering a melee strike on the other and each understanding a bit more about their opponent. Ragnarok understood from that encounter that she was much, much stronger, and while she couldn't inflict any status effects on it, the creature was now in a critical state. The virus hunter, on the other hand, came to the conclusion that it was unable to damage the inmate it was tasked with eliminating by striking its chitin, and so did the next logical thing and struck towards what it assumed were the more vulnerable fleshy parts. Ragnarok saw this coming a mile away, but she didn't fear that at all. She knew her body better than the entity she was fighting did, and used the foe's insistence on melee as an opportunity to deal another 3 strikes with her wrist stingers. The long, wavy, spear-like appendage of the virus hunter jabbed a few times at Ragnarok's more humanoid skin, but the damage that these blows inflicted was just as insignificant as when it hit her chitin. This caused the virus hunter to evaluate the option of engaging in melee, but it quickly came to the conclusion that it would be in danger no matter what range it fought at. Therefore, it simply kept stabbing away at Ragnarok's body, causing minor scratches here and there but not much else, all while the new god of this area used both her wrist stingers, arthropod forelimbs, and both magic and psionic power to pummel the virus hunter to the point that it began to destabilize. As the creature began to unravel itself, Ragnarok understood that its death would be just as violent, if not more so, than its creation. As such, there was only one thing to do. Yeet. As the virus hunter began to degrade into nothingness, Ragnarok used her powers to yeet the being high into the sky before knocking it even higher with a mix of magic, psionics, and even some hyper-focused sonic screams. Eventually, the virus hunter's vessel could not continue existing, and the creature exploded in a brilliant white light that could be seen even from a very long distance away. This battle ultimately began with a nuclear bomb-like explosion, saw the second round begin with one as well, and it ended with an explosion that would make Starfish Prime proud. As the dust settled and the new ruler of the former republic took her time to undo all the damage, or at least some of the damage, caused by the virus hunter, she came to a startling and horrifying realization. In her haste to fight the being that had initially driven her into a corner, her act of punching her way out of the underground pocket had caused one hell of a big kaboom. It was an explosion so massive and powerful that she understood that it would be impossible for Vale to have survived it, and the realization that she may well have killed him was not something she felt good about. However, as the newest addition to this world's growing menagerie of deities forcibly calmed herself down, she realized that she did still feel that telltale sensation of being somewhat connected to Vale. She had known what the lack of such a connection felt like, as she had existed in this new world for quite a while without him being around, as had so many others. But, after even a few short years of feeling that ambient connection, she knew the difference between its presence and absence. She couldn't tell where he was, only that his connection was faint. Whether that meant that he was near death, in some kind of other plane connected to the rest of the new world, or whether he was just very, very far away was something that she could not determine. However, she knew that he was alive, and, knowing him, even if he was on death's door, he would still somehow find a way to come back just as strong if not stronger than ever. Besides, she had to admit that he had an absurdly volatile bit of luck, and, if he was in some kind of danger caused by other people, his potions and natural charm would likely see him through any danger. She wasn't worried anymore and now needed to focus on rebuilding the Broken Republic into something more in line with her style. Anyone born here would immediately be hers from now on, but she did take Vale's lessons to heart. After all, as Vale had said, the best tasting meat is one whose former body was treated with the utmost love and luxury. There is a reason why Wagyu beef is so damn good, after all. And despite saying that, Vale had sworn that he wasn't a cannibal. It must have been. What did they call it? A metaphor. A broken bar. Vale groaned as he lay on the ground, or more specifically, a cobblestone road. When he saw Arachnarok open her eyes, he knew then and there that he needed to pop that random teleportation, and the fact of the matter was that he had indeed escaped utter obliteration. Well, a broken bar mostly. The teleport had gone off just as the blast reached him, and while there was no such thing as radiation damage in the MMO, he wasn't too sure about how much that was true in this new world. Thankfully, the old menu showed nothing had affected him more than giving him some nasty burns and removing a single arm. And once again, the fact that this was a world partially built off of the rules of an MMO was something that he was insanely thankful for. Though he was missing his left arm, which had unfortunately been unconsciously raised to shield him and thus took a decent bit of damage before the teleport kicked in, he could already see the stump beginning to regrow into a full arm. Plus, his clothes were remaking themselves alongside the regeneration of his missing limb, showing fully that the auto-repair option was one of the best things you could ever put on a bit of kit. Still, he had popped into this place around a meter off of the ground and the force of the blast must have shot him through the teleport at a faster speed. He had no clue how that worked out, but it was the only thing he could think of as to why he had been essentially thrown back first via teleportation at a cobblestone road. He was still very sore, and as such he decided to lay where he was and wait for the pain to go away. Despite the annoying injury, he managed to open his eyes and look skyward. At first, he was glad that his eyes had only received the blindness debuff for a few minutes, but now he wasn't exactly sure whether there was a lingering effect or if he had somehow found himself in upstate New England during some inclement weather. The sky was cloudy, dreary, and there seemed to somehow be a light fog that was hanging just above the tops of the buildings around him. Now, even a man who's never seen fog outside of a movie will tell you that, more often than not, fog doesn't just stay above things at a perfectly stable point. In fact, Vale was fairly certain that the fog should, by all known laws of meteorology, be all around him right now and not merely kept at a near-perfect horizontal plane just a few meters above the rooftops. He was getting a bad feeling about this place, and all the previous times that he had such a feeling were times when it went downhill and went downhill fast. With that gut feeling urging him to move, he picked himself up off of the road and limped his way to the side of the street while chugging potions like a Kyle chugged Monster Energy or a stereotypical gamer from the 2010s chugged Mountain Dew. He eventually found a door along the side of the road that was unlocked and, hoping to all things that he wasn't about to stumble into some nasty situation or be arrested for trespassing or breaking and entering. He opened it and managed to get inside and then shut the door behind him. As soon as he had done so, his gut screamed at him to get down and out of the doorway, and he followed that command to the best of his ability, essentially falling behind a corner and using his right arm and hand to pull a few discarded bits of clothing over him. Soon after he had covered himself, he heard the door open and slam against the wall as it was pushed open with extreme force. After that, he heard the sound of multiple sets of feet slowly walk around before they all stopped at once and then walked out of the building, closing the door loudly behind them. Vale continued to hide under the clothing until his arm fully regenerated, but as he did, he swore that he could smell the scent of a salty sea breeze along with the fog that was now rolling down from above and into the building. And, as if he was being driven crazy in the darkness under the clothing, he swore that he saw what seemed to be some kind of weird dog-like creature's muzzle pop into existence within the pile along with him for less than a blink of an eye, slightly disturbing the pile and giving him a really, really bad case of the willies.